At our family Thanksgiving dinner, my grandmother slammed a stack of photographs onto the dining table and screamed at me. She demanded to know why an elderly couple was living in the $1 million Aspen vacation home she had bought for me. I froze and told her the absolute truth. I said I had no idea what she was talking about because I was currently homeless and sleeping in my car. Then our family lawyer walked into the room. My name is Clara. I am 33 years old, and until that precise moment, I thought I knew exactly how cruel my family could be. I was wrong. Before I dive into the details of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to survive a toxic family that tried to break you. The air inside my parents' house was thick with the scent of roasted turkey sage stuffing and expensive heavy perfume. From the outside, my parents, Patricia and Richard, projected the ultimate image of modern American success. Their sprawling Connecticut estate featured a perfectly manicured lawn, grand columns, and a driveway filled with luxury vehicles. But inside, the emotional coldness was suffocating. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a time of gratitude and warmth, but in my family, it was simply another stage for performative wealth and calculated cruelty. I sat alone at a small, wobbly side table near the swinging kitchen door, completely separated from the grand mahogany dining table where the rest of the family was gathered. I was wearing a frayed, oversized green jacket that I had bought from a thrift store 3 years ago. I kept it zipped all the way up because the house was drafty, and I was perpetually cold these days. My hands gripped a cheap glass of tap water. I kept my head down, focusing on the chipped pattern of the wood on my little table, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. I was treated exactly like an unwanted stranger who had wandered in off the street rather than their eldest daughter. I was a freelance 3D animator, a career that required immense dedication and long hours staring at computer screens, rendering complex models. I had spent years honing my craft, yet my family viewed my profession as nothing more than a childish hobby. To them, if you were not wearing a suit or driving a European sports car, you were a complete failure. My stomach rumbled softly. The lavish spread of food on the main table looked incredible, but the knot of anxiety in my throat made it impossible to swallow even a single bite of the dry dinner roll I had been given. The stark contrast between my situation and the lavish display mere feet away was enough to make anyone sick. The main table was a chaotic symphony of clinking crystal glasses, gleaming silver silverware, and loud, arrogant laughter. Holding court at the head of the table was my African-American brother-in-law, Jamal. Jamal was 32 years old, married to my younger sister Natalie, and possessed an ego larger than the mansion we were sitting in. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit and repeatedly gesturing with his left hand to make sure the light caught the massive gold Rolex on his wrist. Jamal was boasting loudly about his luxury car showroom. He practically shouted over the background music, bragging about how he had just closed a deal on 3 imported sports cars and how his profit margins were breaking company records. He spoke with the kind of untouchable arrogance that only comes from someone who believes they are entirely superior to everyone else in the room. Natalie, who was 29, and the undisputed golden child of the family, chimed in right on cue. She tossed her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder and held up her wrist to show off a new diamond bracelet. She made sure everyone knew Jamal had bought it for her just because it was a Tuesday. She talked about her upcoming shopping trips, her exclusive country club memberships, and the designer bags she was waitlisted for. She lived a life of absolute excess, spending money ruthlessly, while our parents beamed at her with pride. My mother, Patricia, hovered over them like a devoted servant. She constantly refilled Jamal's wine glass with expensive vintage red wine and laughed entirely too hard at his mediocre jokes. Patricia was completely obsessed with status and high society. She craved validation from the elite and viewed Jamal and Natalie's flashy lifestyle as her own personal trophy. My father, Richard, sat quietly next to her. He was a spineless man who always chose the path of least resistance. He nodded along to Jamal's boasting, offering weak murmurs of agreement, completely enabling my mother's toxic behavior. Every so often, Patricia would shoot a sharp, disgusted glare in my direction. She would make loud, passive-aggressive comments about how some people simply lacked the drive to succeed. She mentioned how embarrassing it was when adult children refused to pull their weight in society, ensuring her voice carried over the music, so I would hear every single word. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to endure the humiliation. I did not cry. I did not argue back. I just stared at my empty plate, waiting for the evening to end so I could return to my actual reality. Sitting quietly at the opposite end of the main table was my grandmother, Beatrice. At 78 years old, Beatrice was a former business executive with a mind as sharp as a steel trap. She had built a massive fortune through shrewd investments and decades of hard work. Unlike my mother, Beatrice despised flashy displays of wealth and valued genuine hard work. She had been observing the entire spectacle in absolute silence. I noticed her eyes darting between Jamal's extravagant watch, Natalie's diamond bracelet, and my frayed, oversized jacket. Her jaw was clenched tight, and a deep, dangerous shade of red was slowly creeping up her neck. The dining room was filled with the obnoxious sounds of Jamal recounting another story about his supposed brilliance in the automotive industry. Natalie was giggling loudly, and Patricia was clapping her hands in delight. The atmosphere was completely intoxicating for them, a perfect echo chamber of their own vanity. Then, without any warning, the symphony of arrogant laughter came to a violent halt. Beatrice suddenly stood up. Her heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the polished floor, the harsh sound cutting through the room like a knife. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped immediately. Jamal froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open. Patricia dropped her hands to her lap, her smile vanishing as she looked at her mother in confusion. Beatrice reached into her designer leather handbag and pulled out a thick stack of glossy photographs. With a swift, angry motion, she slammed the photographs onto the center of the grand mahogany dining table. The loud smack echoed off the high ceilings. Her face was flushed with absolute fury. She did not look at Patricia. She did not look at Jamal. Her piercing gaze locked directly onto me, sitting alone at my wobbly side table. When she spoke, her voice trembled with a rage that shook the entire room. Why is an elderly couple living in the $1.2 million Aspen vacation home I bought specifically for you 4 years ago? She screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the photographs scattered across the table. Did you sell it to fund your pathetic failures? The heavy silver fork slipped from my trembling hand and clattered loudly against the ceramic plate. The sharp metallic noise echoed in the vast dining room, but I barely registered it. I sat frozen in my chair. My brain struggled to process the words that had just torn through the air. An Aspen vacation home, a $1.2 million property. I stared at the glossy photographs scattered across the fine linen tablecloth. From my small side table, I could clearly see the images. A breathtaking mountain lodge surrounded by pine trees, an elderly couple standing on the front porch, smiling for the camera, a beautifully furnished living room with a colossal stone fireplace. None of it made any sense to me at all. I had never seen that house in my entire life. Instead of bursting into tears or shrinking away from my grandmother's intense fury, a profound sense of bewilderment washed over me. I did not cry because I was not hiding anything. The sheer absurdity of the accusation paralyzed my emotional response. I looked away from the scattered photographs and met Beatrice's furious gaze directly. My voice was completely steady when I finally spoke, cutting straight through the heavy tension suffocating the room. What are you talking about? I don't own an Aspen home. I've been sleeping in my car for the past 3 months. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. It was as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the dining room. The crackling of the fireplace and the soft instrumental music playing from the hidden speakers suddenly felt uncomfortably loud. I watched the faces around the main table react to my statement. Beatrice stood rigidly, her piercing eyes scanning my face, searching for a lie she could not find. I saw a fleeting shadow of genuine panic cross Patricia's perfectly made-up face. Her manicured fingers dug into the edge of the mahogany table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. Richard swallowed heavily, his eyes darting frantically toward Jamal. The contrast between my stark reality and their opulent lifestyle hung heavily in the air. I was sitting there in my frayed, oversized green jacket, admitting to extreme poverty in a room filled with imported crystal and polished silver. For a fleeting second, I thought the truth might actually force my parents to show a shred of humanity. I thought they might express shock or concern that their eldest daughter was living out of a vehicle in the freezing cold. I thought the facade of their perfect upper-middle-class life might crack just enough to let some actual reality in. Instead, Jamal broke the deafening silence with a sudden harsh burst of cruel laughter. He leaned back in his ornate dining chair, throwing his head back as if I had just told the most hilarious joke he had ever heard. The thick gold Rolex on his wrist caught the light from the chandelier as he slapped his hand down heavily on the table. His laughter was loud, obnoxious, and entirely devoid of any warmth. It was a calculated sound designed specifically to shatter the tension and redirect the focus entirely back onto me. "Oh man, that is rich," Jamal scoffed, wiping a fake tear from his eye. He pointed a dismissive finger in my direction. "Come on, Grandma Beatrice, you cannot seriously be listening to this garbage. Look at her. She is probably on drugs. Or maybe she is finally having a complete psychotic break from being unemployed for so long. Sleeping in her car. Please. She is just spinning a pathetic sob story to cover up the fact that she blew all your money." Jamal's aggressive mockery was an immediate tactical strike. He was using his loud, booming voice to dominate the room, trying to make my horrifying reality sound like the ravings of a lunatic. He sneered at my worn-out clothes, shaking his head with exaggerated pity. "You sell $1 million estate, waste the cash on who knows what, and now you want us to believe you are homeless. You need to be committed to a psych ward, Clara." The moment Jamal provided the opening, my father seized it. Richard slammed his fist against the table, rattling the expensive china. His face contorted with performative rage, masking the deep-seated panic I could clearly see swimming in his eyes. "Stop lying right now, Clara," Richard demanded angrily, his voice booming across the room. "You are embarrassing this family in front of your grandmother. How dare you make up such a ridiculous, shameful story? We raised you better than this. You took your grandmother's generous gift, squandered it on your foolish business ventures, and now you have the audacity to sit here and play the victim." My father's words were a barrage of heavy artillery designed to completely discredit me. He did not ask for details. He did not question the photographs. He immediately went on the offensive, painting me as a deceitful, ungrateful child. This was their classic playbook. Whenever the truth threatened to surface, they utilized overwhelming aggression and relentless insults to bury it alive. Natalie chimed in, next her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "Honestly, Clara, this is exactly why nobody wants you around. You are so toxic and manipulative. You literally sold the beautiful house Grandma gave you, and now you are trying to make us all feel bad with this fake homeless narrative. It is actually disgusting. You need serious psychiatric help." Oh. I sat perfectly still at my little table, absorbing the synchronized attack. The coordinated effort to discredit me was breathtaking in its speed and viciousness. Patricia, Richard, Natalie, and Jamal formed an impenetrable wall of denial. They were aggressively gaslighting me, attempting to twist my reality so severely that even I might start to question my own sanity. They threw around words like psychotic, delusional, and toxic with practiced ease, turning the dining room into an absolute nightmare of psychological warfare. Beatrice stood rigidly at the head of the table, her eyes darting between my calm, steadfast expression and the frantic, red-faced shouting of my family. The sheer volume of their attack was designed to drown out any further questions. Yet beneath their loud insults and furious posturing, I noticed the subtle, frantic exchange of looks between Patricia and Jamal. Their eyes conveyed a desperate, masked panic. They were terrified. They were shouting not because they were angry at my supposed lies, but because my simple, honest answer had threatened to pull the pin on a massive grenade they had hidden in the center of the family. They needed Beatrice to believe I was a crazy, drug-addicted failure. They needed to destroy my credibility entirely right there on the spot before anyone could look closer at the Aspen property. They rushed to bury me under an avalanche of shame, completely unaware that their desperate, aggressive performance was exactly what I had been waiting to happen. The sudden shift in tactics was executed with terrifying precision. Realizing that Jamal and Richard's loud aggression might not be enough to fully convince Beatrice, my mother took the floor. Patricia always knew exactly how to play her audience. Her face crumpled. The harsh lines of panic around her eyes instantly melted into a mask of profound, devastating sorrow. She let out a loud, breathless sob that echoed across the dining room, burying her face in her manicured hands. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Patricia pushed her chair back and stood up unsteadily. She swayed just enough to make it look like the weight of my supposed betrayal was physically crushing her. She leaned heavily against the mahogany table, looking directly at my grandmother with tear-filled eyes. "Mom, please!" Patricia wailed, her voice cracking perfectly. "Please do not listen to her. This is exactly what we were afraid of. We tried to protect you from this heartbreak. Clara is lying to you because she is deeply ashamed." Beatrice narrowed her eyes, still clutching the edge of the table. "Ashamed of what Patricia explained this to me right now." Patricia let out another theatrical sob. Richard immediately rushed to her side, wrapping his arm around her shoulders in a show of unified parental grief. Patricia leaned into him, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. "She sold it, Mom," Patricia cried, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "Clara sold the beautiful Aspen house you gave her. We begged her not to. We pleaded with her to keep it as an investment. But you know how she is. You know she never listens to anyone but herself. She poured every single penny from that sale into her ridiculous animation business. She thought she was going to be the next big Hollywood studio executive. She hired people she could not afford, rented studio space she did not need, and she lost it all, every last cent." I sat perfectly still, listening to her weave this intricate, devastating lie. The sheer detail of her fabrication was astounding. She was weaponizing my actual career against me, twisting my passion for 3D animation into a story of reckless financial ruin. Patricia continued her performance, her voice dripping with manufactured maternal agony. When the business completely failed, she was buried in massive debts. She had to liquidate everything just to stay out of federal bankruptcy court. That is why she is sleeping in her car, Mom. She is homeless because she destroyed her own life. We offered to let her move back home, but her pride was too damaged. She cut us off, and now she sits here wearing those rags, trying to blame us to cover up her own monumental failures. The lie was so smooth, so perfectly tailored to prey on Beatrice's strict business principles, that it was almost beautiful in its wickedness. Patricia knew exactly what my grandmother hated most. Beatrice despised financial irresponsibility and squandered opportunities. By framing me as a reckless, failed entrepreneur who threw away $1 million gift, Patricia was expertly shifting Beatrice's fury away from the truth and directly onto my shoulders. Richard tightened his grip on Patricia and turned his furious gaze toward me. He played his part flawlessly, transitioning from the comforting husband to the outraged, heartbroken father. "You are a disgrace to the family name Clara," Richard spat, his voice trembling with manufactured anger. "Your mother has cried herself to sleep for months worrying about you. We kept this a secret from your grandmother because we were trying to protect her health. We did not want her to know that the granddaughter she invested so much in had turned out to be such an absolute disaster. And this is how you repay us, by coming to Thanksgiving dinner and making up insane lies about us stealing from you." Natalie nodded vigorously from her seat, twisting the knife further. "It is always someone else's fault with you, Clara. You could never just admit you were not good enough. You always had to be the starving artist, the rebel who rejected the family business. Now look at you. You are a homeless failure trying to extort money from your own parents." The psychological warfare was suffocating. This was not just a lie about a house. It was a complete assassination of my character. They were taking every insecurity I had ever harbored, every late night I had spent working on my animation portfolio, every struggle I had faced as an independent creator, and using it to build a cage around me. They were rewriting my entire life history right in front of my eyes. Growing up, I was always the outsider. I was the one who preferred sitting in my room sketching storyboards while Natalie attended debutante balls. I was the one who refused to major in corporate finance, choosing instead to study digital arts. My parents had spent my entire life punishing me for that choice. They constantly compared me to Natalie, highlighting her pristine social life and her wealthy husband while treating my career as a shameful secret. Now they were weaponizing that exact dynamic to execute the perfect crime. I sat at my small side table completely isolated. The physical distance between my wobbly wooden table and their grand dining spread had never felt wider. It was me against a synchronized, well-oiled machine of familial deception. They had cornered me. They had provided Beatrice with a perfectly logical, emotionally compelling reason for why I was currently living out of a vehicle. To anyone else in the room, Patricia's tears looked incredibly real. Richard's anger looked entirely justified. Natalie's disgust seemed perfectly warranted. I watched Beatrice's face. The fierce, righteous anger that had possessed her just moments ago began to shift. The absolute certainty in her eyes wavered. She looked at Patricia's sobbing face, then at Richard's protective stance, and finally down at my worn-out thrift store jacket. The trap my family had set was working. They were successfully smothering the truth under a heavy blanket of emotional manipulation. They were absolutely convinced that their synchronized performance had saved them from destruction. They thought my silence was the silence of a defeated, broken woman who had finally been caught in her own lies. They thought they had backed me into a corner from which I could never escape. But they were looking at the wrong thing. They were so focused on their own brilliant performance that they failed to notice my lack of tears. They failed to realize that I was not reacting to their abuse because their abuse was no longer working on me. I simply sat there, observing the mechanics of their lies, letting them dig their hole deeper and deeper. Natalie did not wait for my parents' manufactured grief to fully settle. She seized the opening, her designer heels clicking sharply as she stepped away from Jamal and moved closer to the head of the table. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her voice dripping with a calculated mix of pity and venom. "Grandma, you do not even know the half of it. Do you remember Clara's car accident 4 years ago? We tried to shield you from the ugly details of what happened afterward." Beatrice turned her fierce gaze toward my sister. The mention of the accident clearly struck a nerve. 4 years ago, a drunk driver had T-boned my sedan, leaving me in a coma for 2 weeks with multiple fractured ribs and a shattered femur. It was a trauma that still haunted me physically and mentally. Now, Natalie was dragging that nightmare into the dining room to use as a weapon. "What does the accident have to do with the Aspen house?" Beatrice demanded, her voice tight with a mixture of confusion and lingering rage. Natalie sighed dramatically, placing a comforting hand on Patricia's shoulder. "Everything, Grandma." The accident messed with Clara's head. When she finally woke up and went through rehabilitation, she completely changed. She became erratic. She refused to listen to anyone. The very week she was discharged from the physical therapy center, she listed the Aspen property for sale. "That is a lie," I stated calmly from my small wooden table. My voice was steady, but the sheer audacity of her fabrication sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I was in a wheelchair for 6 months. I could barely hold a pen, let alone negotiate $1 million real estate transaction. Jamal let out a loud, scoffing noise, slamming his palm against the mahogany table. "See, this is exactly the kind of delusion we have been dealing with. You were desperate for cash, Clara. Your little 3D animation gig was tanking because you were stuck in a hospital bed. You panicked. You hired some shady broker, signed the papers from your wheelchair, and liquidated the only valuable asset you had." Richard immediately backed up his son-in-law. "Jamal is right, Beatrice. Clara was absolutely out of her mind with panic. The hospital bills were piling up, and instead of letting us help her, she took matters into her own hands. She sold the property at a massive loss just to get quick cash. We tried to stop her. Patricia begged her on her knees not to throw away your beautiful gift, but Clara screamed at us to get out of her life. The psychological warfare was relentless and perfectly synchronized. They were taking the darkest, most terrifying period of my life and twisting it into a narrative of reckless financial self-destruction. By using the very real trauma of my accident, they were anchoring their massive lie to an undeniable truth. Yes, I had been in an accident. Yes, I had been vulnerable. Yes, I had struggled with massive medical bills. They took those facts and wove a suffocating web of deception around them. Patricia pulled a handkerchief from her pocket, dabbing at her dry eyes. It was the head injury, Mom. The doctors warned us she might experience impulsive behavior and cognitive dissonance. She blew all the money from the house sale within a year. She bought expensive computer equipment for an animation studio that never launched. She paid off imaginary debts. She threw it all away, and when the money ran out, her pride would not let her come back to us. You are insane, I said, looking directly at my mother. You are standing in front of your own mother, fabricating a story about my brain injury to cover up a financial crime. Enough, Natalie shrieked, stepping forward. Stop gaslighting us, Clara. Stop trying to make us look like the bad guys because you cannot handle the consequences of your own psychotic choices. You sold the house. You blew the money. You ended up sleeping in your car. And now you have the nerve to crash our Thanksgiving dinner and call us criminals. The pacing of their attack was incredibly fast, designed to prevent Beatrice from asking any logical questions. If they kept the emotional intensity high enough, Beatrice would be too overwhelmed by the family tragedy to demand actual proof of the sale. Jamal shook his head, looking at me with profound disgust. You know I deal with high net worth individuals every single day at my dealership. I know how to spot a scammer. And you, Clara, are the most pathetic scammer I have ever seen. You ruined your own life, and now you are trying to drag your hard-working parents down with you. The noose was tightening. I sat alone at my isolated side table, absorbing the relentless barrage of insults and lies. To any outside observer, I looked like a deranged, bitter failure who had alienated her loving, successful family. Beatrice's posture began to sag. The fiery indignation that had sparked her initial outburst was being replaced by a heavy, sorrowful exhaustion. She looked at the glossy photographs of the Aspen house on the table, then at my ragged clothes, her eyes reflecting deep disappointment. Patricia saw the shift in her mother's demeanor and pressed her advantage. We hid this from you because we knew it would break your heart, Mom. You worked so hard to provide that safety net for Clara, and she burned it to ashes. We wanted to protect your peace of mind. We have been sending you fake updates about her using the house because we just could not bear to tell you the truth. I watched my father nod vigorously in agreement, his face twisted into a mask of solemn tragedy. They had an answer for everything. Every logical loophole was instantly plugged with a convenient, emotionally charged lie. They were executing a masterclass in manipulation, using my very real trauma to paint me as an unhinged, irresponsible failure who could not be trusted to manage her own life. The sheer weight of their collective deception was meant to crush me. In the past, this exact tactic would have worked. The old Clara would have cried, screamed, and desperately tried to defend herself, only to look even more unstable and hysterical in the process. The old Clara would have let their aggressive gaslighting make her doubt her own memories. But I did not doubt my sanity anymore. I knew exactly where I had been 4 years ago. I knew exactly what had happened in that hospital room. As Jamal sneered at me and Natalie crossed her arms in triumph, I felt the cold, hard certainty of the truth burning in my chest. The psychological warfare was deafening, but it was nothing compared to the silence of the evidence I had meticulously gathered. The heavy double doors of the formal dining room swung open with a deliberate creak that shattered the suffocating tension. Every head in the room snapped toward the entryway. Standing perfectly still in the threshold was Lawyer Harrison. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 60s, wearing a tailored charcoal gray suit that radiated absolute legal authority. In his right hand, he carried a vintage leather briefcase that had seen decades of high-stakes corporate litigation and brutal estate battles. He did not look like a man arriving for a festive holiday dinner. He looked like an executioner stepping up to the block. The moment Patricia saw him, her theatrical sobbing ceased entirely. The transition was so abrupt it was comical. She wiped the imaginary tears from her cheeks with a linen napkin and sat up straight, smoothing the front of her expensive silk blouse. A visible wave of relief washed over my father. Richard relaxed his defensive posture and adjusted his tie, puffing out his chest. Across the grand mahogany table, Natalie leaned over and whispered something into Jamal's ear. A wide, knowing grin spread across Jamal's face. The toxic members of my family exchanged quick, triumphant glances. Their collective arrogance surged back into the room, replacing the brief panic they had exhibited moments earlier. In their greedy minds, Harrison's arrival meant only one thing. They assumed Beatrice had summoned her trusted estate lawyer to officially and permanently write me out of her will. They believed their synchronized performance had worked flawlessly. They thought my grandmother was so thoroughly disgusted by my supposed financial recklessness and erratic behavior that she was prepared to legally sever all ties with me right then and there. Harrison ignored their smug expressions entirely. He walked the length of the dining room with slow, measured footsteps. His leather dress shoes struck the polished hardwood floor with a rhythmic, heavy thud that seemed to echo the rapid beating of my heart. He bypassed the extravagant Thanksgiving turkey, the overflowing crystal wine decanters, and the lavish side dishes without sparing them a single glance. He stopped precisely at the head of the table, positioning himself directly beside Beatrice. The silence in the room returned, but it was no longer a silence of confusion. It was a silence heavy with the anticipation of my utter destruction. Beatrice did not sit down. She remained standing, her fierce eyes fixed on the leather briefcase in Harrison's hands. She gave him a curt, single nod. Harrison placed the briefcase flat on the dining table, right next to the scattered, glossy photographs of the Aspen vacation home. The sharp, metallic click of the brass latches snapping open sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He reached inside and slowly extracted a thick stack of crisp legal papers, stapled together at the corner. The document looked formidable, stamped with official state seals and bearing the formatting of a binding legal contract. Patricia leaned forward in her chair, her eyes gleaming with unconcealed excitement. She looked like a predator watching its prey walk willingly into a steel trap. Richard crossed his arms over his chest, completely ready to witness my final excommunication from the family wealth. Harrison laid the thick document flat on the table, smoothing his hand over the top page. He adjusted his glasses and looked around the room, his expression completely unreadable and devoid of any personal emotion. When he finally spoke, his voice was a deep, resonant baritone that commanded absolute attention. "What we have here is a fully executed, durable power of attorney," Harrison stated plainly. His clinical tone cut through the lingering emotional manipulation my parents had tried to construct. This specific legal instrument was filed and recorded exactly 4 years ago in the state of Colorado. Harrison reached into his breast pocket and retrieved an expensive silver fountain pen. He used the tip of the pen to point directly to the bottom right corner of the final page. "I draw your attention to this specific line," Harrison continued, his voice echoing clearly across the expansive dining room. "This is the authorizing signature." From my isolated, wobbly side table near the kitchen door, I could clearly see the stark black ink on the thick legal paper. It was my signature. My full legal name scrawled awkwardly across the dotted line right next to a bright blue notary stamp. Harrison tapped the silver pen against the paper to emphasize his next point. "According to the binding terms of this document, the signatory granted complete, unchecked, and total financial control over their entire estate. This explicitly included the right to sell, transfer, lease, or liquidate any real estate holdings. It also granted full authority over all bank accounts, investment portfolios, and medical directives." He paused, letting the sheer gravity of those legal terms sink in before delivering the final clarification. This power of attorney granted Patricia total control over Clara's assets. It effectively surrendered every single piece of property Clara owned directly into her mother's hands exactly 4 years ago. The revelation hung heavily over the grand dining table. For my family, this document was their ultimate shield. They viewed it as the irrefutable proof that everything they had done was entirely legal and fully authorized. In their minds, this piece of paper completely validated their twisted narrative. It proved that I had willingly handed over the reins of my life because I was allegedly too erratic and irresponsible to handle my own affairs following the car accident. Jamal's reaction was immediate and dripping with absolute contempt. He picked up his crystal wine glass, swirling the expensive vintage red liquid with a slow, arrogant motion. He leaned far back into his ornate dining chair, crossing one tailored leg over the other. A cruel, satisfied smirk spread across his face as he took a long, deliberate sip of his wine. He looked directly at me from across the room, his eyes shining with pure, malicious joy. Jamal was entirely ready to watch me be completely destroyed by this legal evidence. He firmly believed that Harrison had just nailed my coffin shut. He thought the power of attorney was the absolute end of the discussion, the final definitive proof that I was a lying, homeless failure who had no legal standing and no right to complain about losing $1 million mountain lodge. The arrogant sneer on his face indicated that he was already imagining the moment security would arrive to physically drag me out of the mansion and back into the freezing cold driveway. My family sat in absolute triumph, totally convinced that their coordinated psychological warfare and this binding legal document had secured their victory. They were so blinded by their own greed and arrogance that they failed to realize the true nature of the trap they were standing in. I stared intensely at the stark black ink on the heavy legal paper. The signature was definitely mine, but the strokes were jagged, uneven, and painfully weak. It did not look like the confident signature of a healthy woman making a rational financial decision. It looked exactly like the desperate scrawl of someone barely clinging to consciousness. A rapid, sharp realization hit me with the force of a freight train, knocking the breath completely out of my lungs. The dining room with its crystal chandeliers and obnoxious laughter faded into the background. My mind violently yanked me back to a sterile, brightly lit room 4 years ago. The memory hit me with chilling clarity. I was lying in the intensive care unit, surrounded by a chaotic symphony of beeping heart monitors and hissing oxygen machines. My body was a broken landscape of shattered bones and deep internal bruising. The pain from my T-bone sedan accident was so excruciating that the doctors had me on a continuous, heavy intravenous drip of liquid painkillers. My mind was floating in a thick, murky fog of narcotics. I could barely keep my eyes open, let alone comprehend my surroundings. I was fighting for my life, terrified and completely vulnerable. That was when Patricia walked into my hospital room. She did not come with flowers or words of maternal comfort. She marched in carrying a heavy clipboard loaded with dense text-heavy documents. She stood directly over my hospital bed, blocking out the fluorescent overhead lights. I remembered her voice perfectly. It was smooth, urgent, and laced with a manufactured panic designed to frighten a heavily sedated patient. She told me the hospital administration was threatening to cut off my life-saving care. She claimed the insurance company was rejecting my claims and that I needed to sign a stack of urgent medical billing forms immediately to authorize my continued treatment. I remembered the heavy weight of the plastic pen she forced into my trembling hand. I remembered how my fingers shook so badly that she physically had to guide my hand to the bottom of the page. I trusted her. She was my mother. In my narcotic haze, facing the terrifying prospect of losing my medical care, I believed she was acting as my fierce protector. I signed exactly where she pointed, over and over again, desperate to simply close my eyes and escape the agonizing physical pain. I blinked and the sterile walls of the ICU instantly dissolved back into the opulent Thanksgiving dining room. I looked away from the legal document and locked my eyes directly onto Patricia. She was sitting there dabbing at her dry eyes with a linen napkin, playing the role of a devastated parent. The absolute horrifying truth washed over me like a bucket of ice water. Patricia had not brought me medical billing forms. She had brought me a durable power of attorney. While I lay in a hospital bed with a shattered femur and broken ribs fighting just to draw my next breath, my own mother was executing a meticulously planned heist. She used my severe physical trauma and heavy sedation as an opportunity to rob me blind. She weaponized my trust and my incapacitated state to steal a $1.2 million mountain lodge. This was not a case of a parent making a poor financial decision on behalf of a struggling child. This was a calculated, cold-blooded, and highly illegal criminal act. The betrayal I felt in that moment crossed a massive, unforgivable boundary. For my entire life, my family had subjected me to relentless emotional abuse, toxic comparisons, and cruel psychological manipulation. I had grown accustomed to being the scapegoat. I had learned to endure their sneers and their constant attempts to make me feel worthless. But this revelation elevated their toxicity to an entirely different stratosphere. Patricia had looked down at her own child broken and bleeding in an intensive care unit and saw nothing but a lucrative financial opportunity. She saw $1 million asset ripe for the taking. She carefully orchestrated the forgery of my legal consent, ensuring she had absolute control over my wealth before I could even regain the cognitive ability to stop her. She essentially left me for dead financially while pretending to hold my hand. The sheer depravity of her actions extinguished any remaining trace of familial loyalty I might have harbored deep in my soul. The profound sadness and childhood longing for a mother's love died completely in that dining room. In its place, a sharp, crystalline resolve solidified in my chest. I looked at Jamal, who was still swirling his expensive red wine and grinning at me with absolute contempt. I looked at Richard, puffing out his chest with unearned righteous indignation. I looked at Natalie, crossing her arms and basking in the glow of her stolen diamond bracelet. They genuinely believed this piece of paper was their ultimate shield. They thought Lawyer Harrison had just delivered the killing blow to my credibility. They thought the power of attorney proved their innocence and my erratic insanity. I sat down at the table, completely unbothered by the pathetic slight. My dining companions were a collection of distant elderly cousins and socially awkward business acquaintances who had clearly been grouped together as an afterthought. While they complained about the draft from the kitchen doors, I calmly unfolded my heavy linen napkin and placed it on my lap. When the waiter served the main course, a perfectly seared filet mignon resting on truffle puree, I picked up my silver knife and began to eat with absolute unwavering composure. I did not glare at the head table. I did not show a single ounce of the humiliation Catherine so desperately wanted to provoke. Every time my mother shot a smug, superior glance in my direction, hoping to see me brooding in the shadows, I simply offered her a cool, detached smile, chewing my steak with the relaxed elegance of a woman holding all the winning cards. I did not break down. I did not scream at Patricia for what she had done to me in that hospital room. I remained perfectly still at my wobbly side table, my fraying green jacket zipped tight against the draft. My silence was no longer born of shock or fear. It was the silence of a predator watching its prey step willingly into an inescapable trap. The game had fundamentally changed, and they had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. The scent of roasted turkey and rich gravy suddenly made my stomach turn, but my mind had never been sharper. I mentally cataloged every single detail of the fraudulent document laying on the mahogany table. The blue notary stamp next to my jagged signature was the final puzzle piece. A notary public had to be present to witness a power of attorney. Patricia had clearly bribed or colluded with a corrupt notary to stamp a document while the signatory was medically incapacitated. The layers of this conspiracy were deep, involving multiple acts of severe fraud. They had built an entire empire of lies on the back of my tragedy. They bought luxury cars, designer jewelry, and country club memberships using the blood money they siphoned from my stolen property. And now they sat around a feast funded by my near-fatal accident, demanding that I apologize for ruining their holiday. The absolute audacity was staggering, but it fueled the fire burning inside me. Every single dismissive comment my father had ever made about my career choice flashed through my memory. Every time Natalie had flaunted her wealth and called me a failure, she was doing it with cash stolen directly from my name. They had orchestrated a masterpiece of deceit. They isolated me, drove me into poverty, and then mocked my suffering to make themselves feel superior. But their arrogance had finally blinded them to their own exposure. Lawyer Harrison stood silently by the table, waiting for the dust to settle completely, unaware that he had just triggered the detonation sequence of Patricia's entire fake upper-class existence. The power of attorney was not a final judgment against me. It was the undeniable physical proof of grand theft. The tension in my shoulders vanished. I was no longer the frightened, confused daughter trying to earn her family's love. I was the architect of their imminent destruction, and the demolition was about to begin. The sharp metallic click of Jamal adjusting his heavy gold Rolex echoed in the sudden quiet of the dining room. He pushed his ornate wooden chair back with a loud, abrasive scrape against the polished hardwood floor. Standing up, he took a moment to smooth the lapels of his custom-tailored Italian suit, adopting the posture of a victorious king who had just vanquished a pathetic, unworthy peasant. He looked down at me from across the vast expanse of the room, his eyes filled with a mixture of absolute triumph and profound disgust. He treated me like a repulsive insect that had somehow crawled out of the plumbing and onto their pristine holiday table. He waved his hand dismissively toward the power of attorney document resting near my grandmother. We have black and white proof right there on the table. The legal system has spoken. We are completely done here. Can we finally get this garbage out of our house? I am trying to enjoy a 5-star Thanksgiving feast, and quite frankly, her homeless stench is completely ruining my appetite. Jamal actually raised a hand to pinch the bridge of his nose, a highly theatrical and cruel gesture designed to maximize my humiliation. He laughed, a deep rumbling sound of pure mockery. I cannot believe we even let her through the front door. Look at her sitting there in that filthy jacket. She looks like a disease. Natalie was instantly energized by her husband's viciousness. She leaned forward, her diamond bracelets clinking against the fine china, and unleashed her own barrage of insults. Her high-pitched voice grated against my ears as she complained about how my mere presence was ruining the entire aesthetic of their perfect holiday gathering. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my frayed green jacket, maliciously mocking the faded fabric and the torn, dirty cuffs. It is actually embarrassing to be related to you, Clara, Natalie sneered, twisting her face into a mask of pure snobbery. You show up looking like a complete beggar trying to extort our parents over a perfectly legal document. You signed away your rights 4 years ago because you knew you were a catastrophic mess. You knew you could not manage a single penny. You are just too broke and pathetic to accept reality now. Go find a shelter. Richard, emboldened by the legal document sitting on the table and the aggressive chorus of his family, decided it was time to play the role of the tough, uncompromising patriarch. He stood up abruptly, slamming his fist down on the mahogany table. He pointed a rigid, trembling finger toward the heavy oak front door of the mansion. You heard your brother-in-law, Clara? Get out of my house right this instant, Richard shouted, his face turning a deep, angry shade of purple. You have completely disgraced this family for the absolute last time. I will not stand here and allow you to hurl baseless, psychotic accusations at your mother when we have definitive legal proof of your own staggering incompetence sitting right there for everyone to see. The verbal abuse escalated at a dizzying pace. My father reached into his tailored slacks and pulled out his cell phone, holding it up like a loaded weapon. He glared at me with an intense, burning hatred that fully shattered any remaining illusion of paternal love. If you do not turn around and walk out that door this exact second, I am calling the police. Richard threatened, his voice dripping with venom. I will have you arrested for criminal trespassing. I will tell the dispatchers that a deranged homeless woman broke into our private property and is actively threatening our safety. Do you understand me? You have zero rights in this house. You have absolutely nothing. Patricia chimed back, in her previous performance of a heartbroken, weeping mother completely evaporating. Now that she felt totally and legally protected by Lawyer Harrison's document, her true venomous nature radiated through the room. She looked down her nose at me, a cold, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She no longer needed to pretend to care. You have always been a massive, suffocating disappointment, Clara, Patricia said, her voice dropping to a harsh, cruel whisper that carried perfectly across the silent room. You were a burden we carried out of sheer pity. We stepped in and took control of your assets to save you from your own staggering stupidity. Your complete lack of gratitude right now just proves that you are an absolute lost cause. Go back to your car. Go back to the freezing gutters where you belong. The sheer magnitude of their arrogance filled every single corner of the grand dining room. They were aggressively feeding off each other's cruelty, inflating their egos to an astronomical level. They were completely drunk on their perceived victory, utterly convinced that their synchronized bullying had permanently neutralized the threat I posed. Jamal picked up his crystal glass and poured himself a generous amount of expensive vintage red wine. He raised the glass high in the air, loudly proposing a toast to family loyalty and legal victories. It was a sickening, grotesque display of pure hypocrisy. Natalie clinked her glass against his, giggling like a spoiled child who had just gotten away with torturing a stray animal. Patricia and Richard joined the toast, their faces glowing with immense, arrogant relief. They looked at me with absolute contempt, entirely convinced they had won the war. They believed the piece of paper on the table was an impenetrable shield of armor that rendered them completely untouchable. They thought they had successfully crushed me into submission, expecting me to stand up, hang my head in shame, and scurry out into the freezing winter night. They were setting themselves up for a massive, catastrophic fall, blind to the fact that their towering arrogance was the exact mechanism that would trigger their ultimate destruction. The clinking of their crystal glasses rang through the dining room, a sharp and hollow sound that punctuated their delusional victory. I sat at my wobbly side table and did absolutely nothing. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not beg my father to put his phone away, nor did I plead with my mother to finally show me an ounce of mercy. I just sat there. The sheer volume of their celebration crashed against my total unnatural stillness. Jamal was wiping a tear of mirth from his eye, and Natalie was practically vibrating with malicious joy, but my face remained an impassive mask of stone. I let the silence stretch. I let it grow heavy and thick, wrapping around my shoulders like a protective armor. In the past, this was the exact moment I would have broken. I would have folded into myself, apologizing for existing, letting their aggressive gaslighting rewrite my own reality. Not tonight. Tonight my silence was a loaded weapon, and I was holding my finger perfectly steady on the trigger. My internal monologue was entirely devoid of fear. I looked at the glossy photographs of the Aspen property lying next to the fraudulent power of attorney. A year ago, seeing that document might have sent me into a blind, hyperventilating panic. But during those agonizing 3 months of sleeping in the cramped back seat of my car, shivering through the bitter autumn nights, I had meticulously burned away every last shred of the desperate approval-seeking daughter they thought they knew. The cold nights had crystallized my resolve. While they were busy sipping imported wine and congratulating themselves on their brilliant scam, I had been working in the shadows. I had skipped meals and endured the biting cold specifically to fund my quiet war. Every insult they hurled at me right now simply confirmed that my absolute lack of mercy was entirely justified. I was no longer their victim. I was the architect of their impending ruin, and watching them celebrate their false victory was intensely, profoundly satisfying. The loud, chaotic noise of my family began to ring hollow against my unwavering gaze. I stared directly into Patricia's eyes. My gaze was ice-cold, completely stripped of any daughterly affection or fear. I did not blink. I just watched her. Slowly, the intoxicating rush of their collective arrogance began to sour. The high-pitched giggling from Natalie tapered off into an awkward, nervous throat clearing. Richard lowered his cell phone, his thumb hovering over the keypad, suddenly unsure of what to do with the threat he had just issued. Jamal took another sip of his wine, but his boisterous swagger faltered. My absolute refusal to react was short-circuiting their entire psychological playbook. They needed me to cry to validate their power. They needed me to scream so they could label me hysterical. My total, unblinking silence was a massive, terrifying anomaly they did not know how to handle. The room grew colder, the oppressive tension shifting rapidly from my small table back to the center of their grand dining arrangement. Beatrice stood at the head of the table, her hands resting flat on the mahogany surface. She had watched my family's vicious attack with her jaw tightly clenched, but now her sharp, calculating eyes were locked entirely on me. Beatrice was a ruthless businesswoman who had survived decades in cutthroat industries. She knew what defeat looked like, and she knew what a calculated ambush looked like. As she watched me absorb the barrage of insults, without shedding a single tear, her posture shifted. The disappointment in her eyes morphed into intense, piercing scrutiny. She recognized the cold, deadpan stare of someone who was holding a winning hand. Next to her, Lawyer Harrison stood completely still. His trained legal mind was assessing the drastic shift in the room's atmosphere. He had seen countless families tear each other apart over money, but the unnatural calm radiating from my corner of the room clearly put him on high alert. He adjusted his grip on his leather briefcase, sensing that the dynamic had just violently reversed. The quietness emanating from me became a physical force pressing down on the chests of my abusers. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her manicured fingers twisting her linen napkin into a tight knot. She opened her mouth to launch another insult to desperately try and spark the emotional breakdown they needed from me, but the words died in her throat. My steady, freezing glare paralyzed her. I was looking at her not as a mother, but as a criminal suspect who had just willingly provided a full confession. Richard glanced nervously at the front door, realizing his threat to call the police had completely backfired. If he called the authorities, he would simply be bringing law enforcement directly to the scene of his own massive financial crime. Jamal's smirk finally dissolved entirely, replaced by a deep, unsettling frown. The sheer gravity of my silence was suffocating them. They had dug their own grave, proudly displaying the forged legal document as their trophy, completely oblivious to the fact that I had engineered this exact scenario. I allowed the heavy, suffocating silence to stretch for another agonizing minute. Every second that ticked by drained another ounce of confidence from my family. The beautiful, opulent dining room with its crystal chandeliers and silver platters felt like a highly pressurized submarine about to implode. I took a slow, deliberate breath, drawing the cold air deep into my lungs. The adrenaline rushing through my veins made my senses incredibly sharp. I could hear the rapid, nervous breathing of my sister. I could see the sweat forming on Jamal's forehead. I could smell the sharp tang of fear cutting through Patricia's heavy designer perfume. This was the calm before the storm, the precise, terrifying moment when the ocean recedes right before a colossal tidal wave strikes the shore. I placed my hands flat on the wobbly wooden table. The old Clara was dead buried under 4 years of deceit, medical trauma, and financial abuse. The new Clara was fully awake, armed to the teeth with irrefutable evidence and entirely ready to pull the trigger. I slowly reached up and grasped the cold metal zipper of my frayed green jacket. The harsh, raspy sound of the zipper pulling down cut through the dead air of the dining room. Every eye tracked my movement. They probably thought I was reaching for a tissue, or perhaps preparing to show them some pathetic eviction notice to beg for their mercy. Instead, I slid my hand deep into the oversized inner pocket of the coat. My fingers wrapped around the thick, heavy spine of a meticulously organized legal file folder. I had guarded this folder with my life. It had been my only companion during those freezing nights in the back seat of my sedan. I pulled it out. I stood up from my wobbly side table. I did not rush. I took slow, measured steps across the polished hardwood floor, crossing the massive divide between my isolated corner and their opulent center stage. Jamal shifted in his seat, his posture suddenly rigid as I approached. Patricia shrank back slightly, her hand flying to her chest. I ignored them both. I walked directly past my mother, past my father, and stopped right next to Lawyer Harrison. I raised the thick, heavy folder high in the air and slammed it down onto the mahogany table. The explosive smack echoed off the high ceilings, shaking the crystal wine glasses and making Natalie jump in her chair. I placed it exactly 1 inch away from their fraudulent power of attorney. I looked directly at Jamal. My voice, when it finally broke the silence, was entirely devoid of emotion. It was calm, razor-sharp, and clinical. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Jamal," I stated, my tone chillingly flat. "I have been sleeping in my car for the past 3 months. I have washed my face in public restroom sinks. I have layered my clothing to survive the bitter autumn nights, and I have eaten cheap canned food while parked in dimly lit supermarket lots. You guessed that part perfectly." A brief, confused smirk tried to return to Jamal's face, but it died before it could fully form. He opened his mouth to deliver another insult, but my piercing gaze pinned him to his chair. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer, terrifying command in my presence forced him into silence. However, I continued, turning my eyes slowly to Patricia, whose face was rapidly draining of color. You are catastrophically wrong about the reason. I am not broke. I did not lose a single penny to a failed business venture. I am not buried in debt, and I certainly did not liquidate $1 million mountain lodge to cover any medical bills. I lived in my car as a calculated, deliberate choice. It was a strategic sacrifice. The confusion in the room morphed into a palpable, suffocating dread. Richard took a nervous step back, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy file folder I had just slammed onto the table. Natalie dropped her hands to her lap, her fingers frantically twisting the diamond bracelet she had been flaunting just moments ago. The narrative they had so carefully constructed was beginning to fracture, and they could feel the ground shifting violently beneath their feet. When you live out of a vehicle, your living expenses drop to absolute zero, I explained, leaning slightly over the table, forcing them to shrink away from me. No rent, no utilities, no extraneous bills. My freelance 3D animation career is actually incredibly lucrative. I design high-end architectural visualizations and commercial assets for top-tier tech firms. Every single dollar I earned over the last 3 months went directly into a hidden, secure offshore account. I needed a massive amount of liquid cash, and I needed it fast without any of you noticing my financial movements. I chose to freeze in the back of my sedan so that I could secretly fund a war against my own family. Patricia let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. The fake, theatrical, motherly sorrow was entirely gone, now replaced by the stark, wide-eyed terror of a cornered animal. She looked at the folder, then at me, her mind frantically trying to calculate how much I actually knew. I needed that money, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous metallic whisper, to hire the most ruthless, uncompromisable, independent financial auditors in this state. I needed capital to retain a top-tier private investigator who specializes in uncovering hidden corporate assets and offshore shell companies. I subjected myself to homelessness specifically so I could meticulously dismantle every single lie you have told over the last 4 years. I wanted to map out every single wire transfer, every fake signature, and every stolen dollar. The smug, arrogant atmosphere of the Thanksgiving feast had been utterly annihilated. I was completely in control of the room now. The power dynamic had violently inverted. I was no longer the outcast daughter sitting at the children's table. I was the commanding, terrifying force in the center of their universe, dictating the terms of their destruction. Beatrice watched me with an intense, unblinking focus. The disappointment that had clouded her eyes earlier had vanished completely. She recognized the ironclad resolve in my posture. She knew with the sharp instinct of a veteran businesswoman that someone who willingly subjects themselves to 3 months of homelessness just to build a legal trap does not come to the table with empty threats. Harrison remained perfectly still, his professional demeanor masking his obvious intrigue. He did not touch my folder, respecting the absolute dominance I had just asserted over the situation. I placed my hand flat on top of my file folder. The thick stack of evidence pulsed under my palm like a live explosive. I looked at each of my toxic family members, holding their terrified gazes one by one. Jamal was sweating profusely, his custom-tailored suit suddenly looking very tight and uncomfortable. Natalie was hyperventilating, taking short, panicked breaths. Richard looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner measure the rope. "You thought you were so incredibly smart," I said, my voice cutting through them like shattered glass. "You thought my silence meant I was defeated. You thought you could parade that forged piece of trash in front of Grandmother Beatrice and walk away with clean hands. But you did not realize that I have been tracking your every move. I know exactly what you did while I was fighting for my life in the intensive care unit. And more importantly, I have every single receipt. I had effectively locked the doors and sealed the windows. They had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no more lies left to tell. The trap I had sacrificed so much to build was fully operational, and I was about to rip the lid off the darkest, most lucrative secret they had ever kept. I flipped open the heavy cover of my meticulously organized file folder. The crisp white pages inside were filled with highlighted bank statements, tax records, and surveillance logs. I did not look up immediately. I let the visual weight of the evidence command their absolute attention before I delivered my next strike. You all love to mock my 3D animation career. I began, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating air of the dining room. You called it a childish hobby. You told your wealthy country club friends I was a starving artist, making pretty pictures in a damp basement. You used my passion as a punchline to elevate your own pathetic egos. I pulled out a certified bank statement printed on heavy official letterhead and slid it directly across the mahogany table toward my father. That childish hobby secured exclusive long-term contracts with three of the largest architectural firms in North America and a major international video game studio, I stated, watching his eyes track the sliding paper. My gross income last year alone was well over $400,000. I have been financially independent and thriving while you were busy spinning lies about my supposed failures. Richard stared at the bold, undeniable numbers printed on the bank statement, his jaw practically unhinging. Patricia strained her neck to see the document, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. Jamal shifted uncomfortably in his ornate chair, suddenly realizing my actual verifiable income likely rivaled his heavily exaggerated car dealership profits. The realization that I was not the penniless outcast they had manufactured was striking them like a physical blow. But simply making that kind of money was not enough. I continued pacing slowly and deliberately behind my wobbly wooden table. Because fighting a highly orchestrated multi-million-dollar financial fraud requires liquid, untraceable capital. If I had stayed in my comfortable apartment, if I had continued living the affluent life I could easily afford, you might have noticed my resources. You might have seen the private investigators I was meeting, or the forensic accountants I was hiring. You might have caught wind of my movements, panicked, and destroyed the paper trail before I could secure it. I could not risk you getting spooked, so I packed my absolute essentials into my sedan, canceled my lease, and vanished completely off your radar. I slept in freezing, dimly lit parking lots and ate canned soup specifically to amass a massive war chest of unencumbered, untraceable cash. I reached back into the thick folder and produced a crumpled, official-looking government envelope. It bore the unmistakable, terrifying seal of the Internal Revenue Service. "Do you want to know how your brilliant, foolproof scam finally unraveled?" I asked, looking directly into Patricia's terrified eyes. It was not a grand, dramatic mistake. It was a simple, careless clerical error, the kind of sloppy oversight made by arrogant people who think they are completely untouchable. I held the envelope up high for the entire room to see, making sure the federal seal was visible to everyone, including Lawyer Harrison, who was now watching me with intense professional respect. 3.5 months ago, I went to check an old post office box I had kept active since my college days. I explained, my tone surgical and precise. Mixed in with the junk mail and old magazine subscriptions was this: a final warning tax penalty notice from the IRS regarding unpaid municipal property taxes for a luxury lodge in Aspen, Colorado, an estate that was completely 100% registered in my legal name. Patricia let out a quiet, strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. I had never been to Aspen, I continued relentlessly. I had never purchased real estate in my entire life. Yet here was the federal government threatening to place a severe tax lien on my personal assets for a property valued at $1.2 million. A lesser person might have panicked and called their mother for help. A more trusting, naive daughter might have assumed it was simply a case of mistaken identity or corporate fraud by a stranger. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, closing the distance between my reality and their lies. But I knew you, Patricia. I remembered that massive stack of urgent medical billing forms you forced into my trembling hands while I was heavily medicated in the intensive care unit. I remembered your manufactured panic, your crocodile tears, and your aggressive insistence that my health insurance was being denied. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying crystal clarity. I realized my own mother had forged a weapon against me while I was bleeding in a hospital bed. Instead of calling you blindly and giving you the chance to burn the evidence, I went to war in the shadows. I began pulling documents from the folder with rapid, rhythmic precision, slapping each one onto the table with a sharp smack that made my sister jump. Here's the comprehensive 60-page report from the top-tier independent financial auditor I retained, I announced, dropping the heavy binder. Here are the surveillance logs, wire transfer traces, and offshore asset maps from the private investigator who spent the last 8 weeks dissecting your entire financial existence. I dropped another thick file. And here is the certified chain of custody for the Aspen property deed, directly linking the fraudulent power of attorney to your personal bank accounts. The exposition hit them like rapid-fire artillery. The dining room was completely paralyzed. My family was absolutely speechless. Patricia was physically shaking her hands, gripping the armrests of her chair, as if she were plummeting down a steep roller coaster. Richard looked utterly hollowed out, his blustering patriarchal facade entirely crushed under the sheer weight of federal tax documents. Natalie had covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes darting frantically between me and the damning paperwork. Jamal was entirely silent. His previous arrogance, his mocking laughter, and his cruel jokes were completely eradicated. He was staring at the table, his mind desperately trying to calculate the legal fallout of the documents I had just presented. He realized he was trapped in a room with a woman who had systematically dismantled their entire criminal enterprise while living out of a car. You assumed my silence over the past few years was the silence of a defeated, broken victim. I stated, my voice echoing in the dead quiet of the room. You thought you had successfully buried me under your fake power of attorney and your endless social manipulation. But I was not buried. I was simply digging my way beneath your foundation. You handed me the shovel when you underestimated my intelligence, and now I am going to show you exactly what I found in the dirt. She was trembling, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing to the floor. The false bravado she had worn like a crown all evening had completely evaporated. I leaned forward slightly, resting my fingertips on the massive stack of evidence I had just presented. I made sure to lock eyes with Patricia, refusing to let her look away. I did not come to Thanksgiving dinner to beg for food, I said. My voice was a bone-chilling whisper that easily carried across the absolute silence of the room. I came to trap you. Patricia flinched, pulling back into her chair. Richard opened his mouth to utter another hollow threat, but his voice failed him. They were finally beginning to understand the catastrophic magnitude of their mistake. For weeks I had just meticulously planned this exact confrontation. I could have simply handed my files over to the authorities, but that would have given them time to scramble. That would have allowed Patricia to shred documents, transfer funds, and concoct another elaborate lie to feed to Beatrice. I knew that if they had even a moment of warning, they would spin a narrative that painted me as a greedy, ungrateful child trying to extort her loving parents. I needed a scenario where they would willingly incriminate themselves with absolutely no avenue for escape. That was why I chose today. Thanksgiving was the one day of the year they could not resist staging a grand performance of their fake wealth. I knew they would invite Beatrice to show off. I knew Jamal and Natalie would be here flaunting the luxury lifestyle they had built on my stolen assets. I also knew that Beatrice would likely bring lawyer Harrison, as she often consulted him regarding end-of-year tax planning during the holidays. The stage was set perfectly. All I had to do was walk through the front door wearing a frayed jacket and let their inherent arrogance do the rest of the work. I needed all of you in one room. I explained, my tone surgical and precise. I needed you gathered around this ridiculous mahogany table surrounded by your crystal glasses and imported wine. Most importantly, I needed Grandmother Beatrice and Lawyer Harrison to be sitting right there watching your every move. If I had just accused you of fraud, you would have denied it. You would have cried your tears and sworn you were innocent. So I did not accuse you. I simply sat at my wobbly side table, drank my tap water, and waited for you to hang yourselves. The realization of what they had just done began to dawn on Jamal. He glanced at the fraudulent power of attorney document still resting on the table, realizing it was not a shield, but a highly toxic piece of evidence. He rubbed his face with his hands, his expensive Rolex flashing under the chandelier light, though the gesture no longer looked arrogant. It looked entirely desperate. You could not help yourselves. I continued, pacing slowly behind my chair. When grandmother confronted you about the Aspen property, you panicked. Instead of keeping your mouth shut, you rushed to defend your scam. You eagerly produced that forged power of attorney to justify your actions. You gloated about it. You used it to mock me and throw me out of the house. In doing so, you willingly admitted to possessing and utilizing a fraudulent legal instrument to control an asset worth over $1 million. And you did it right in front of a high-powered estate attorney. You just confessed to grand theft, forgery, and elder abuse. You handed the physical evidence of your crimes directly to an officer of the court. You did the police's job for them. The atmosphere in this room completely flipped. The psychological walls they had built around themselves shattered into a million pieces. The predators who had spent the last hour hunting me suddenly realized they had marched willingly into a slaughterhouse. They were the prey. The look of pure, unadulterated horror on Natalie's face was deeply satisfying. She clutched her diamond bracelet, her breathing shallow and rapid. She was finally grasping that her entire luxurious existence was built on a criminal enterprise that had just been exposed in front of the very people who controlled the family wealth. Richard tried to stand up again, his knees visibly shaking. "Clara, please!" he stammered, his voice stripped of all its previous anger. "We can explain. We were just holding the asset for you. We were trying to manage it until you got back on your feet." "Do not insult my intelligence, Richard," I snapped. "You were looting it. You thought my silence earlier meant I was weak, but silence is only weakness when you have nothing to say. I had plenty to say. I was simply letting you finish your confessions before I closed the trap." The tension in the dining room skyrocketed. The air felt thick, heavy, and charged with electricity. Beatrice had not moved a muscle. She was watching her daughter and son-in-law self-destruct, her face a mask of furious disgust. Jamal frantically typed on his cell phone under the table. He was likely trying to move money or alert his shady business partners, but I knew it was entirely useless. They thought the revelation of the forged power of attorney was the worst thing that could happen to them tonight. They thought the loss of the Aspen house and the family inheritance was the ultimate punishment. They had absolutely no idea how deep this investigation went. I rested my hands on the thick file folder again, feeling the weight of the financial reports inside. I took a deep breath, preparing to drop the final crushing evidence. With a swift, decisive motion, I flipped the thick file folder completely open. I grabbed a massive stack of highlighted bank statements, property tax records, and wire transfer logs. I did not just hand them to Lawyer Harrison, I hurled them across the grand mahogany dining table. The heavy paper cascaded through the air, fluttering down and landing directly on top of the extravagant Thanksgiving turkey, the expensive cranberry sauce, and the crystal gravy boats. Gravy splattered against Patricia's pristine silk blouse, but she was too paralyzed by fear to even wipe it off. "Let us talk about those glossy photographs you were so furious about, grandmother," I said, pointing to the pictures Beatrice had thrown down earlier. "You asked why an elderly couple was standing on the porch of the $1 million Aspen vacation home you bought for me. You naturally assumed, thanks to Patricia's brilliant storytelling, that I had carelessly sold the property for quick cash to fund a failed business. But my mother is far too greedy for a simple one-time sale. A direct sale leaves a massive taxable paper trail. She wanted a continuous, untraceable stream of passive income." I walked around the table, tapping my finger against a specific bank statement that had landed near Richard's plate. They did not sell the house. They turned it into a predatory cash cow. Patricia and Richard engaged in a highly lucrative lease-to-own scam with that innocent elderly couple in the photograph. It is a brilliant financial maneuver if you possess absolutely zero moral compass. The entire room watched me in stunned silence as I broke down the financial forensics with brutal surgical precision. I had spent hours locked in my freezing car studying these exact documents with my auditor, and I knew the numbers by heart. 4 years ago, right after Patricia forged my signature on that power of attorney, she listed the Aspen Lodge on a private luxury real estate network. I explained, projecting my voice so every syllable rang crystal clear. She found a wealthy retired couple looking for their dream mountain home. Instead of a traditional sale, Patricia locked them into an aggressive lease-to-own contract. She demanded a massive non-refundable upfront option fee. That was $150,000 in pure unadulterated cash, deposited straight into a hidden account the very week I was learning how to walk again in physical therapy. Natalie gasped, her eyes dropping to the table. Even Jamal looked sick, realizing the sheer scale of the fraud his mother-in-law had orchestrated. But the upfront fee was just the appetizer, I continued relentlessly. The contract stipulated a monthly rental payment of $12,000. $12,000 every single month for 4 consecutive years. Do the math, Richard. Actually, I will do it for you. That is $576,000 in rental income. Combined with the initial option fee, you and Patricia have illegally siphoned nearly $750,000 from my property. You have been quietly collecting tens of thousands of dollars in illicit cash flow while I was budgeting for canned beans. Beatrice looked like she had been struck by lightning. The true terrifying scope of her daughter's betrayal was finally laid bare. She was not just dealing with a forged document. She was looking at a highly sophisticated multi-year real estate scam. And here is the most despicable part of your entire operation, I said, turning my freezing gaze directly back to Patricia. That elderly couple in the photograph genuinely believes they are building equity toward purchasing that home. They think they are executing a valid contract. But because you forged the power of attorney, and because the deed is technically still registered entirely in my legal name, the contract you signed with them is completely null and void. It is a fraudulent instrument. I let that devastating fact settle over the room. You are scamming them out of their life savings. When the lease term ends next month, and they attempt to execute their purchase option, they will discover they have been paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to a woman who has zero legal right to sell them the property. You dragged innocent third parties into a massive interstate real estate fraud just to fund your lavish lifestyle here in Connecticut. Patricia's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The gravy stain on her blouse matched the muddy, sinking reality of her situation. She raised her trembling hands frantically, trying to articulate a defense. Clara, you do not understand corporate finance. We were protecting the asset. We were investing the capital to generate a higher yield for the family trust. We were going to transfer the profits back to you eventually. Do not lie to me, I shouted, my voice finally rising, cracking the silence like a whip. You were never going to transfer a single dime. You bled my asset dry so you could play rich, and you threw me out on the street to ensure I would never ask questions. Lawyer Harrison reached across the table, carefully pulling a few of the bank statements away from the ruined turkey. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and rapidly scanned the highlighted account numbers and wire transfer logs. His experienced legal mind verified my claims in a matter of seconds. He looked up at Beatrice and gave her a grim, confirming nod. The forensics were absolutely flawless. The illicit cash flow was clearly documented, matching my exact description. The immensely satisfying payoff washed over me. I had just dismantled their pristine upper-class facade using nothing but cold, hard arithmetic. I watched the intricate, greedy mechanics of my parents' fraud lie bare under the bright dining room chandelier. They had spent years mocking my intelligence, treating me like a naive, foolish girl who could not handle the real world. Now they were suffocating under the weight of my meticulous financial investigation. But I was not finished. The rent money they had stolen was just the fuel. I still needed to show everyone exactly what kind of engine that fuel was running, and that required turning my attention to the most arrogant man in the room. I still needed to show everyone exactly what kind of engine that fuel was running, and that required turning my attention to the most arrogant man in the room. But before I could dismantle Jamal's pathetic empire, I had to expose the clandestine pipeline that fed it. You see, when you steal over $500,000 in illegal rent, you cannot simply deposit it into your joint checking account at the local bank branch. I said, my voice echoing across the silent dining room. That kind of sudden, massive cash flow triggers automatic suspicious activity reports. It alerts the federal government. It alerts the banking institutions. And most dangerously for Patricia, it would have instantly alerted grandmother Beatrice. I reached back into my heavy file folder and pulled out a thick packet of blue paper. I slapped it down onto the mahogany wood right beside the ruined Thanksgiving turkey. So my mother created a ghost, I announced. This is the official certification of formation for a limited liability company called Summit Crest Ventures. It was quietly registered in the state of Delaware exactly 3 weeks after the forged power of attorney was stamped. Delaware is famous for corporate anonymity. It is a notorious haven for people who want to hide their wealth behind an impenetrable wall of legal secrecy. Patricia paid a registered agent service a premium fee to act as the public face of the company. She listed herself as the sole managing member in the private operating agreement, effectively keeping her name completely off the public registry. I pointed to the highlighted sections of the document, making sure the entire room could follow the trail of deceit. From the outside, Summit Crest Ventures looked like a legitimate corporate entity. I continued pacing slowly behind my wobbly side table, but in reality, it was nothing more than an empty hollow shell. It had no employees, no actual office, and no legitimate business operations. Its sole purpose was to act as a financial vacuum cleaner. Every single month on the first day of the month, that elderly couple in Aspen wired $12,000 directly into the corporate checking account of Summit Crest Ventures. To the couple, they were simply paying their lease to own premium to a property management firm. But the second that money hit the Delaware account, Patricia scrubbed it clean. The room was so quiet I could hear the expensive grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. She washed the dirty rental income by reclassifying it as corporate dividends and bogus consulting fees. I explained with clinical precision. She systematically laundered hundreds of thousands of dollars right under the nose of the Internal Revenue Service, completely evading income tax while hiding the stolen wealth from everyone in this room. The word launder echoed against the crystal chandeliers. Patricia absolutely snapped. The thin veneer of her upper-class composure shattered into a million jagged pieces. She lunged forward, her heavy wooden chair tipping backward and crashing loudly onto the hardwood floor. Her face was contorted in a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. "Shut up! Shut your mouth right now!" Patricia shrieked, her voice pitching into a trembling, hysterical wail. She scrambled towards the center of the table, her hands grasping wildly at the scattered bank statements and corporate filings. She desperately tried to scoop the papers into her arms, smearing turkey grease and cranberry sauce across her expensive silk blouse. "You have no right. This is stolen property. You hacked my private computers. You are committing corporate espionage. Clara Richard, do something. Call the police and have her arrested for stealing my private mail." Patricia was completely unhinged, screaming at the top of her lungs to drown out the devastating facts. She was frantically trying to destroy the evidence, tearing at the pages with her manicured nails. But before my father could even flinch, Lawyer Harrison stepped forward. The imposing estate attorney did not raise his voice to a scream. He did not have to. He simply projected his deep, resonant baritone with the absolute crushing authority of a seasoned litigator. "Sit down immediately, Patricia," Harrison commanded. The sheer force of his voice hit my mother like a physical blow. She froze, her hands still clutching a crumpled bank statement, her chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths. "Do not touch another piece of paper on this table," Harrison warned, his eyes narrowing into cold, furious slits. "If you destroy or tamper with financial documents in front of an officer of the court, I will personally guarantee you face charges for spoliation of evidence." Patricia slowly opened her trembling fingers, letting the crumpled paper fall back onto the mahogany wood. Harrison calmly reached past her and picked up the blue packet, detailing the Delaware Shell Company. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes sweeping over the federal employer identification number, the registered agent credentials, and the attached financial routing logs. The room waited in agonizing silence as he scrutinized the paperwork. I knew my auditor had prepared an airtight dossier, and I watched Harrison verify every single line of it. Harrison looked up from the documents and turned his stern gaze directly onto my mother. "These are not hacked documents, Patricia," he stated, his voice dripping with professional disgust. "These are certified, publicly filed state records cross-referenced with legally obtained banking logs. The forensic trail is completely unbroken. This is highly legitimate, undeniable financial evidence of a structured money laundering operation. You deliberately created a fictitious entity to obscure the origin of capital and evade federal taxation. The words money laundering and evade federal taxation hung in the air like a death sentence. Patricia stumbled backward, her legs giving out beneath her. She collapsed into her father's empty chair, her hands covering her mouth as a suffocating wave of reality crashed over her. Richard was sweating profusely, his face drained of all color. He pulled at the collar of his dress shirt, suddenly realizing that the Internal Revenue Service did not care about their country club status or their fabricated family image. The federal government only cared about hidden income, and Patricia had just been caught hiding a mountain of it. The walls of their opulent Connecticut mansion were rapidly closing in, transforming their luxurious fortress into a claustrophobic prison of their own making. They were completely cornered. The legal validation from Beatrice's trusted attorney had instantly stripped away their ability to gaslight or deny the truth. They were exposed as white-collar criminals, sitting at a Thanksgiving dinner table. I stood tall, watching their absolute despair. The phantom company they had built to hide their greed had been dragged out into the harsh light of day. And now that the pipeline of dirty money was fully exposed, it was finally time to show everyone exactly where all that illegal cash was flowing. I turned my freezing gaze away from my mother and locked eyes directly with Jamal, who was now trembling visibly. The transformation in his demeanor was absolutely spectacular. The loud, booming patriarch who had dominated the dining table just an hour ago was entirely gone. Jamal was sweating profusely. Thick beads of perspiration formed along his forehead and rolled down the sides of his face, soaking into the pristine white collar of his custom-tailored Italian suit. His previously arrogant posture had collapsed. He was slouched in his ornate chair, his wide eyes darting frantically toward the heavy file folder resting on the mahogany wood. He knew exactly what kind of absolute destruction was coming next. "Did you really think I would stop at tracing the money into a Delaware shell company?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "A ghost company is useless, unless it has a way to legitimize the cash it absorbs. The dirty money needed to re-enter the real world looking like clean taxable revenue. It desperately needed a seemingly legitimate investment vehicle to function properly. And that is exactly where you stepped in, Jamal." I reached into the folder and pulled out a stapled packet of financial disclosures. I tossed it onto the table, letting it slide right in front of him. "Let us talk about your famous luxury car showroom," I said, my tone dripping with clinical precision. "The empire you supposedly built from the ground up with your own sheer brilliance. I pulled the corporate filings for your dealership. According to the state registry, your business was launched exactly 3.5 years ago. That timeline perfectly aligns with the exact moment Patricia began collecting the massive lease to own payments from my stolen Aspen property." Jamal swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously in his throat. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but no words came out. The crushing weight of the evidence had paralyzed his vocal cords. "You see, Beatrice," I said, turning my attention briefly to my grandmother, "Jamal is not a successful self-made entrepreneur. He is a fraud. When he wanted to open his luxury dealership, he went to 3 different traditional banks for a commercial loan. Every single one of them rejected his application because he had terrible credit and zero collateral. He could not secure a single dime of legitimate funding. But he did not need a legitimate bank," I continued relentlessly. "Patricia used Summit Crest Ventures to act as an anonymous angel investor for your dealership. Every single month, the dirty money generated from the stolen Aspen lease was quietly funneled directly into your corporate accounts under the guise of venture capital injections." Natalie let out a high-pitched gasp. She dropped her hands to her lap, frantically trying to cover the diamond bracelet she had been flaunting all night. "Your entire business is a pathetic facade, Jamal," I stated, my voice echoing across the silent room. "You do not own an empire. You operate a giant, glittering laundromat. The imported sports cars sitting on your showroom floor were not purchased with your brilliant sales profits. They were purchased with the money Patricia stole from me while I was bleeding in an intensive care unit. You built your entire identity on the back of my physical trauma." The sheer devastations of my words hit Jamal like a physical strike. His broad shoulders sagged. The heavy gold Rolex on his left wrist suddenly looked like a cheap, heavy shackle. I stared directly at that watch. "Take a really good look at that Rolex, Jamal," I commanded. "Take a look at your custom suit. Take a look at your wife's designer bags and the diamond jewelry she buys just for fun. You love to walk around acting like you are the king of the world, mocking my frayed clothes and calling me a homeless failure. But every single ounce of wealth you possess was bought and paid for with my blood." Jamal tried to push his chair back, desperate to create some distance between us. His breathing became ragged. The polished, untouchable persona he projected to the world shattered completely in front of the entire room. He was no longer a high-rolling executive. He was a small, greedy man who had been caught red-handed living on stolen charity. "You are nothing but a parasite," I said, delivering the ultimate devastating blow to his fragile ego. "You could not succeed on your own merits, so you gladly accepted stolen funds from a woman who robbed her own critically injured daughter. You knew exactly where that seed money came from. You turned a blind eye to the obvious fraud because you were too desperate to play the role of a rich man." Natalie began to hyperventilate. Her eyes darted wildly between me, her husband, and Lawyer Harrison. She had spent her entire adult life believing she was vastly superior to me. Now she was forced to confront the horrifying reality that her entire glamorous existence was entirely funded by my stolen assets. She was wearing my money. She was driving my money. She was living inside a giant, sparkling lie. "Clara, please," Jamal finally choked out. His voice was incredibly weak. "I did not know the specifics. Patricia just said she had an investment group ready to back me. I swear to you, I did not know she stole it from your medical recovery fund." "Do not lie to me, Jamal," I snapped. "You knew Patricia was running the funds through a blind shell company. You signed the investment contracts. You are a registered corporate officer who accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars from an anonymous Delaware entity without conducting a single background check. In the eyes of the federal government, willful ignorance is not a valid legal defense. It is simply complicity." Lawyer Harrison nodded slowly from his position next to Beatrice. He adjusted his glasses, his sharp legal mind clearly calculating the severe criminal liability Jamal had just exposed himself to. Harrison's silent validation of my argument was the final nail in Jamal's coffin. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating. The predators had been entirely stripped of their fangs. Jamal slouched down in his chair, completely defeated, staring blankly at the ruined Thanksgiving turkey. His massive ego had been publicly executed. He had truly been exposed as a complete fraud in front of his wealthy mother-in-law, his wife, and the highly respected estate attorney he had been trying to impress all night. The massive, towering, arrogant facade he had built was completely annihilated. I did not give them a second to recover from the shock. I needed them to understand that this was no longer a simple family dispute over a piece of real estate. They had crossed a dangerous boundary, leaving the realm of domestic toxicity and marching straight into the unforgiving crosshairs of the American federal justice system. I placed my hands on the table, leaning forward to address the room. My voice dropped to a low, commanding register that left absolutely no room for debate. "You are all sitting here acting like you simply made a bad parenting decision," I stated, my eyes locking onto my father. "But the United States Department of Justice does not care about your warped family dynamics. The federal government only cares about statutes' intent and paper trails. And the paper trail you have left behind is a blazing neon sign pointing directly to a federal penitentiary." Patricia let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her throat. The word penitentiary echoed, shattering whatever tiny shred of hope she had left. "Let us start at the very beginning of your criminal enterprise," I said, pointing directly at the fraudulent power of attorney document lying next to the ruined turkey. "When you walked into my intensive care unit 4 years ago, you committed fraudulent inducement. I was incapacitated on a continuous intravenous drip of Schedule II narcotics. You knowingly presented a legal instrument under the guise of urgent medical billing, deceiving a vulnerable patient into signing away her entire net worth. That is a severe felony. Furthermore, because a corrupt notary public stamped that document without verifying my cognitive state, you engaged in a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. Richard swallowed so loudly I could hear it from across the table. His hands were shaking violently as he realized the sheer legal peril of their actions. But your grand theft was just the catalyst. I continued relentlessly, shifting my gaze to Jamal. Once you secured the Aspen property, you had to extract the cash. Every time that elderly couple wired their $12,000 monthly payment to your fake shell company, you committed federal wire fraud. The moment those illicit funds crossed state lines, you triggered federal jurisdiction. You did this every single month for 4 consecutive years. Under federal sentencing guidelines, each count carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in federal prison. Natalie began to cry. She was genuinely terrified, finally understanding that her designer lifestyle had been funded by highly illegal activities. And then we arrive at the absolute masterpiece of your sheer stupidity, I announced, pulling the IRS tax penalty envelope from the top of the file folder and holding it up for everyone to see. Tax evasion. You generated over $500,000 in pure, unadulterated income through that predatory lease-to-own scam. But because you funneled that money into Summit Crest Ventures and disguised it as corporate dividends and venture capital for Jamal's dealership, you completely failed to report the true nature of that income to the Internal Revenue Service. I slapped the federal envelope back down onto the table. You intentionally filed fraudulent tax returns for 4 consecutive years, I explained with surgical precision. You structured your financial transactions to evade mandatory reporting requirements. You engaged in money laundering to wash the stolen rent money so Natalie and Jamal could buy luxury cars and diamond bracelets without triggering an audit. You thought you were outsmarting the entire system. But the IRS Criminal Investigation Division does not play around with coordinated multi-state money laundering operations. Patricia looked like she was about to vomit. She slumped sideways in her chair, gripping the edge of the table to keep from sliding onto the floor. Her chest heaved with rapid, panicked breaths. She looked pleadingly at Lawyer Harrison, desperately hoping the seasoned attorney would find a flaw in my legal logic. She prayed he would tell her I was just making up terrifying legal jargon to scare them. Harrison did not offer her a single shred of comfort. He stood tall beside my grandmother, adjusting his suit jacket with a grim professional demeanor. He looked down at Patricia with profound disgust. "Clara is absolutely correct," Harrison stated, his deep baritone voice driving the final nail into their coffin. "Ignorance is not a valid defense in federal court, Patricia. The forensic evidence presented here clearly demonstrates a sophisticated, premeditated effort to conceal assets and evade taxation. The utilization of a Delaware shell company to funnel illicit funds across state lines directly into a commercial automotive business constitutes a textbook money laundering operation. If the federal authorities audit these accounts, and they absolutely will, they will not see a family dispute. They will see a highly organized criminal syndicate." Jamal buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, agonizing groan. He knew Harrison was right. He knew his automotive dealership was legally compromised. The federal government could seize his entire inventory under asset forfeiture laws because the business was capitalized with stolen, laundered money. His entire empire was an active crime scene. "You built a house of cards on top of a federal crime," I said, delivering the final crushing blow. "Every single piece of food on this table, every drop of wine in your glasses, and the very clothes on your backs were purchased with stolen money that you failed to pay taxes on. You are white-collar criminals, and your grand, luxurious lifestyle is about to be completely dismantled by the United States government." The sheer gravity of my words crushed the remaining air out of the room. My toxic family was completely paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. They were staring down the barrel of decades in federal prison, massive financial ruin, and the absolute destruction of their pristine public image. They had nothing left to say. There were no more lies to spin, no more manipulations to try, and no more gaslighting that could save them. They were completely, utterly defeated. But the true climax of the evening had not even arrived yet. I watched them wallow in their silent, suffocating terror, knowing that the trap I had carefully laid was about to spring its final, inescapable mechanism. The legal breakdown had thoroughly destroyed their minds, but the physical consequences were already waiting right outside the front door, preparing to strike with absolute, undeniable federal force. The heavy silence in the dining room was broken only by the ragged, panicked breathing of my family. I stood at the edge of my wobbly side table watching the sheer terror wash over them. From across the room, Lawyer Harrison caught my eye. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. The trap was fully primed. Right on cue, the heavy brass chime of the mansion's front doorbell echoed through the vaulted ceilings. The sound was deafening. It cut through the thick, oppressive atmosphere like a siren. Patricia flinched violently, knocking her crystal wine glass onto the floor. It shattered into a dozen pieces, sending dark red wine pooling across the expensive Persian rug. Richard leaped from his chair, his eyes darting wildly toward the grand entryway. Natalie grabbed Jamal's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his custom-tailored suit jacket. Jamal did not move. He was completely paralyzed, staring at the archway leading to the foyer with a look of pure, unadulterated dread. They all knew with a sudden and terrifying certainty that this was not a neighbor stopping by to borrow sugar. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed on the marble floor of the foyer. My father did not even have the chance to walk to the door. The housekeeper had already opened it, stepping aside, as three imposing figures marched directly into the dining room. They did not wear the standard blue uniforms of the local Connecticut Police Department. These individuals wore dark tactical windbreakers over crisp button-down shirts. Emblazoned across their chests and backs in bold yellow lettering were the initials IRSCI. Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation. Clipped to their belts were heavy-duty holsters, and gleaming gold federal badges hung prominently from chains around their necks. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized authority spreading out to secure the perimeter of the dining room. They were not here to ask polite questions. They were here to execute federal warrants. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern, unforgiving face, stepped forward. He did not look at the extravagant Thanksgiving feast, the crystal chandeliers, or the terrified faces of my parents. He looked down at a thick clipboard in his hand, flipping open the top page. Patricia and Richard. The lead agent announced, his voice a booming baritone that commanded absolute submission. He looked up, his sharp eyes locking directly onto my mother. And Jamal. We are special agents with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. We are here to execute multiple federal search and seizure warrants regarding Summit Crest Ventures, your luxury automotive dealership, and your personal financial accounts. The collective reaction of my toxic family was a masterpiece of absolute catastrophic collapse. The untouchable, arrogant facade they had maintained for my entire life shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. The cathartic release I felt in that exact moment was indescribable. Years of enduring their cruel mockery, years of being called a failure, years of sleeping in the freezing back seat of my car, all culminated in this spectacular, undeniable manifestation of justice. Patricia physically gave out. Her legs crumbled beneath her and she slumped heavily against the mahogany dining table, dragging the expensive linen tablecloth down with her. The remaining gravy boat tipped over, spilling cold, congealed fat across her designer skirt. She began to hyperventilate, taking short, wheezing gasps of air. Her meticulously applied makeup was completely ruined, dark mascara streaming down her cheeks in jagged, ugly lines. She looked wildly at the federal agents, holding up her shaking hands, as if she could physically push away the reality of her impending incarceration. She tried to speak, tried to deploy her usual high society charm, but all that escaped her throat was a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. Richard, the man who had threatened to have me arrested for trespassing just 20 minutes ago, was reduced to a trembling, spineless coward. He backed away from the dining table, his hands raised in a gesture of immediate surrender. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked at the gold badges hanging from the agents' necks, and the horrifying reality of federal prison finally sank into his brain. He realized instantly that his country club memberships, his golf buddies, and his perceived status could not save him from the United States government. He was a white-collar criminal caught red-handed, and he looked entirely broken. Natalie burst into hysterical, uncontrollable sobs. She curled into a ball in her ornate dining chair, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. She kept frantically rubbing the diamond bracelet on her wrist, as if trying to physically hold on to the stolen wealth that was rapidly slipping through her fingers. She looked at Jamal with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for her husband to fix the situation, to use his loud, booming voice to intimidate the agents and make the nightmare stop. But Jamal was utterly destroyed. The arrogant, flashy businessman who had laughed in my face and mocked my poverty was entirely gone. The sweat that had been beading on his forehead was now pouring down his face. He kept opening and closing his mouth, looking like a fish suffocating on dry land. He stared at the lead federal agent, his chest heaving. He knew that the agent standing in the dining room meant his dealership was already crawling with federal investigators. He knew his inventory was being seized, his files were being confiscated, and his entire fake empire was being violently dismantled. He looked down at his heavy gold Rolex, a symbol of his stolen success, and slowly slid his hands off the table, completely surrendering to the devastating weight of his own greed. The second agent, a sharp-eyed woman with a tight bun, stepped forward and pulled a stack of official documents from her tactical vest. She handed them directly to Lawyer Harrison, completely ignoring Patricia's desperate reaching hands. Harrison briefly reviewed the federal warrants, nodding his head in professional acknowledgement of their absolute legal validity. "Nobody move," the lead agent instructed, his voice echoing with cold, hard authority. "Keep your hands visible and remain exactly where you are. We have agents currently securing the perimeter of this property, and a secondary team is simultaneously executing warrants at your commercial dealership location. Do not attempt to access your cell phones or destroy any documents." I stood in the corner of the dining room, my frayed green jacket zipped tight against the evening draft. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to bury me. They were completely paralyzed, trapped in a cage built entirely by their own arrogance and greed. The heavy, suffocating silence had returned, but this time I was not the one being crushed by it. The trap had sprung, the steel jaws had clamped shut, and my toxic family was finally facing the absolute undeniable consequences of their actions. The lead agent lowered his clipboard. His gaze swept across the ruined Thanksgiving table, moving past the spilled wine and the scattered financial documents before locking onto my mother. The sheer authority radiating from him commanded absolute silence. When he finally spoke, his voice possessed the cold, mechanical precision of a crushing industrial press. "Patricia and Richard," the agent began, articulating every syllable with deliberate weight, "you are currently the primary subjects of an active multi-agency federal investigation. The Internal Revenue Service, in conjunction with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, has been monitoring the financial transactions of Summit Crest Ventures for several weeks. Your attempts to obscure the origin of your capital were thoroughly documented." Patricia let out a ragged, choking gasp, clutching her chest, as if she had just been physically struck. Richard remained frozen, his eyes wide and vacant. "Furthermore," the agent continued, turning his sharp gaze toward Jamal, "your commercial automotive enterprise has been identified as a primary mechanism for laundering these illicit funds. As a direct result of the forensic evidence obtained, a federal judge signed a comprehensive seizure order late last night." The second agent, the woman with the tight bun, stepped forward. She pulled a thick stack of printed banking notices from her tactical vest and dropped them directly onto the mahogany table. They landed with a heavy, definitive thud right next to my own pile of evidence. "At exactly 8 o'clock this morning," the lead agent announced, "federal warrants were executed across 6 different banking institutions. Every single financial account associated with your names, your businesses, and your shell companies was officially frozen. The United States government has seized total control of your assets." The absolute finality of those words slammed into the room. The opulent, arrogant lifestyle my family had flaunted for years evaporated into thin air in a matter of seconds. "Your personal savings accounts, Patricia," the lead agent specified, reading directly from his clipboard. "The joint checking accounts you share with your husband, the offshore routing accounts tied to Summit Crest Ventures, all of them currently have a balance of 0 available funds. They are locked pending federal forfeiture." My mother let out a high-pitched, agonizing wail. She scrambled desperately at the edge of the table, her manicured fingers clawing at the polished wood as if trying to find a handhold on a sinking ship. The millions she thought she had successfully stolen, the wealth she used to secure her precious country club status, the financial security she bragged about just an hour ago, it was all completely gone. She was instantly reduced to absolute destitution. The lead agent did not pause to let her grieve. He turned his attention back to my brother-in-law. Jamal, the operational accounts for your luxury car showroom were frozen simultaneously. Your corporate payroll accounts, your vendor credit lines, and your business checking reserves are entirely locked. You cannot authorize a single transaction. You cannot pay your employees. You cannot move a single vehicle off your showroom floor without explicit federal authorization. As of this morning, your business is effectively dead. Jamal slumped forward, burying his face in his trembling hands. A low, guttural groan escaped his lips. The flashy, untouchable entrepreneur who had relentlessly mocked my poverty was now realizing he could not even afford to buy a cup of coffee. His custom-tailored suit and heavy gold Rolex suddenly looked like ridiculous costumes on a broken, penniless man. His entire empire had been a fragile illusion, and the federal government had just blown it away like dust. Natalie, completely frantic and unable to process the magnitude of the disaster, reached blindly into her designer handbag. She pulled out her phone and a shiny platinum credit card, her fingers shaking so violently she dropped the card onto the floor. "You cannot do this!" Natalie shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "I have bills on autopay. I have a trip to Paris booked for next week. My credit limit is flawless." The female agent stepped closer to Natalie, her expression utterly devoid of sympathy. "Put the phone down immediately," she instructed sharply. "Your credit accounts are tethered to the laundered funds provided by your husband's compromised business. Your platinum cards, your travel accounts, and your personal checking balances were frozen alongside the corporate assets. You have absolutely no access to credit or cash." Natalie stared down at the piece of plastic resting on the expensive Persian rug. The realization hit her with devastating force. The diamond bracelet on her wrist, the designer dress she wore, the lavish vacations she constantly bragged about on social media, they were all over. She was entirely cut off. She was suddenly poorer than the homeless sister she had spent the entire evening degrading. Richard finally found a weak, trembling fraction of his voice. He looked at Lawyer Harrison, his eyes pleading for some kind of legal miracle. "Harrison, please," Richard begged, his voice cracking pathetically. "You have to help us. You have to call a defense attorney. We need representation. We can pay." Harrison looked at my father with profound, icy contempt. "Pay with what, Richard?" Harrison asked, his deep voice carrying a brutal dose of reality. "Your assets are frozen under federal money laundering statutes. You have zero liquid capital. You cannot retain a high-powered criminal defense firm because you cannot pay a retainer. You are completely financially paralyzed." Richard's mouth opened and closed silently. The horrific truth settled over him. They had stolen my money to play rich, and now they were facing the terrifying machinery of the federal justice system without a single dollar to defend themselves. They were entirely stripped of the power and privilege they had wielded like weapons against me for my entire life. The lead agent stepped back, securing his clipboard. "Today we are executing search and seizure warrants to secure physical evidence," he announced, his tone shifting to a stark, ominous warning. "We will be confiscating computers, physical ledgers, and financial records from this property. However, make no mistake, based on the overwhelming forensic evidence already in our possession, formal indictments will be handed down shortly." The agent looked around the room, making direct eye contact with Patricia, Richard, Natalie, and Jamal. "You are facing imminent arrest for multiple federal felonies. You are hereby instructed to surrender your passports to the agents currently searching the upstairs bedrooms. Do not attempt to leave the state of Connecticut. Do not attempt to contact any offshore banking institutions. When the grand jury convenes, federal marshals will arrive to take you into custody." Imminent arrest. The words hung in the dining room, thick and suffocating. My family was not just broke, they were criminals waiting for the handcuffs to click around their wrists. The lavish Thanksgiving dinner had transformed into a crime scene. The extravagant mansion they loved to show off was about to be seized by the government to pay back the taxes they evaded. I stood quietly in my corner, my frayed green jacket, feeling warmer and more comfortable than any designer gown. I had watched them construct a massive glittering tower of lies, and I had just watched the federal government smash it to pieces in less than 5 minutes. They had tried to destroy me, but in their boundless greed and towering arrogance, they had only managed to entirely obliterate themselves. The trap had worked flawlessly, and the absolute ruin of my toxic family was finally spectacularly complete. The absolute ruin of my toxic family was finally spectacularly complete. But the spectacle was far from over. The moment the crushing reality of federal prison sentences settled over the dining room, the fragile, superficial loyalty that bound my family together instantly vaporized. There is no honor among thieves, and there is certainly no loyalty among narcissists facing decades behind bars. Jamal was the first to break. The terrifying prospect of losing his freedom completely shattered his arrogant facade. He scrambled backward, his chair scraping violently against the floor, eager to put as much physical distance between himself and my parents as possible. His eyes darted frantically toward the lead IRS agent. The sweat on his face was now a steady stream of pure, unadulterated panic. "It was all her idea," Jamal screamed, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Patricia. "I had absolutely nothing to do with the initial fraud. You have to believe me. She came to me with the capital. She set up the Delaware Shell Company. She told me she had liquidated a legitimate family trust to help fund my dealership. I am a victim of her manipulation." The sheer cowardice of his outburst was astounding. Just an hour ago, Jamal was parading around the room like a king, mocking my poverty and boasting about his unparalleled business acumen. Now he was throwing his own mother-in-law under a fleet of federal buses, desperately squealing like a cornered rat to save his own skin. "Are you insane?" Richard roared, stepping toward his son-in-law with his fists clenched though his entire body was shaking. "You signed the investment documents, Jamal. You knew exactly where those monthly wire transfers were originating. Do not you dare stand there and try to pin your own corporate money laundering operation entirely on my wife." "You both knew?" Jamal yelled back, his voice echoing shrilly across the room. "You and Patricia orchestrated the entire lease-to-own scam. You dragged my business into your dirty financial web because you needed a place to clean your stolen cash, officer. I will cooperate fully. I will hand over every single ledger, every email, every text message between us. Just grant me immunity." Natalie let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She lunged toward Jamal, grabbing his custom-tailored lapels, her diamond bracelet flashing wildly. "How could you do this to us? How could you turn on my family? My parents gave you everything. You are abandoning me to save yourself." Jamal roughly shoved Natalie away, a look of profound disgust twisting his features. "Your parents gave me stolen money, Natalie. They turned me into a federal target. I am not going to a maximum security prison because your mother decided to rob your sister blind while she was in a coma." The dining room descended into a vicious, ugly civil war. The perfectly curated upper-class family was now a pit of venomous snakes, viciously striking at one another to secure a plea deal. The three federal agents simply stood back and watched the implosion, their expressions a mix of professional detachment and mild disgust. They had seen this exact scenario play out countless times before. When the federal hammer falls, the rats always devour each other. Patricia watched her son-in-law eagerly offer up her head on a silver platter. Her eyes were wide, darting wildly around the room, searching for any possible exit, any remaining lifeline. She looked at Richard, who was pale and sweating, completely useless. She looked at Lawyer Harrison, who was already stepping away, making it abundantly clear he would not defend her. Finally, her desperate, panicked gaze locked onto me. I stood perfectly still in my corner, my hands resting calmly in the pockets of my frayed green jacket. I watched her mind work. Patricia realized that legal maneuvering and arrogant gaslighting were no longer viable options. She had been stripped of her wealth, her status, and her power. She had only one weapon left in her arsenal, the ultimate toxic trump card she had used to manipulate me my entire life. Patricia lunged forward. She threw herself onto the hardwood floor, crawling over the spilled red wine and shattered crystal. She did not care that the expensive fabric of her designer skirt was soaking up the dark liquid. She scrambled across the floor until she reached my boots. With a loud, agonizing wail, Patricia threw her arms around my legs. Her manicured hands desperately gripped the bottom hem of my old, worn-out jacket. She looked up at me, her face a grotesque mask of ruined makeup, tears, and absolute groveling terror. "Clara, please!" Patricia sobbed, her voice a pathetic grating whine that echoed off the high ceilings. "Please, I am begging you. You have to stop this. You have to tell them it was all a big misunderstanding. Tell them you gave me permission to manage the house. Tell them you forgive us." I stared down at the woman who had spent 33 years making me feel completely worthless. The sheer psychological satisfaction of watching my abuser kneel in the dirt at my feet was overwhelming. "Clara, I am your mother," Patricia wailed, tightening her grip on my jacket, her knuckles white with desperation. "Blood is thicker than water. We are family. You cannot do this to me. You cannot let your own flesh and blood go to a federal prison. I will not survive it. The conditions, the inmates, it will kill me. Please, my beautiful smart girl, you have to save me." The rapid whiplash transition was astounding. Less than an hour ago, I was a psychotic, toxic, homeless failure who needed to be violently thrown out into the freezing winter night. Now suddenly, I was her beautiful, smart girl. Now suddenly, blood was thicker than water. She was invoking the sacred bond of motherhood, attempting to squeeze a drop of pity from the daughter she had callously left to bleed out financially in an intensive care unit. "We will give it all back," Patricia pleaded, tears streaming down her face, leaving muddy streaks of mascara across her cheeks. "We will find a way to repay every single dollar. We will sign the Aspen house back over to you tonight. Just call off the federal agents. Just tell them you do not want to press charges. You are a good person, Clara. You have such a kind, forgiving heart. You cannot send your parents to jail." Her pathetic begging was a vile, transparent attempt to exploit the very empathy she had always mocked me for having. She expected me to fold. She expected the ingrained childhood conditioning of a daughter desperately wanting her mother's love to override my sense of justice. She genuinely believed that if she cried hard enough, if she put on a convincing enough performance of maternal desperation, I would shield her from the devastating consequences of her own criminal greed. She was clinging to my frayed jacket as if it were a life raft, completely ignoring the fact that she was the one who had thrown me into the freezing ocean in the first place. I looked down at the woman groveling on the floor. For 33 years, I had craved her affection. I had contorted my personality, sacrificed my boundaries, and desperately sought a single word of validation from her lips. Seeing her now reduced to a weeping, ruined mess on her own expensive Persian rug, I expected to feel a flicker of pity. I expected the ingrained instinct of a daughter to kick in and compel me to comfort her. But there was absolutely nothing. The emotional well was completely dry. Patricia had drained every last drop of my empathy on the day she stood over my hospital bed and forged my signature. The tears streaming down her face were not born of remorse or love. They were the selfish, terrified tears of a criminal who had finally run out of runway and realized her opulent lifestyle was ending in federal prison. I did not reach down to help her up. I did not offer her a reassuring smile or a comforting hand. Instead, I planted my boots firmly on the hardwood floor and took a deliberate, powerful step backward. I yanked the hem of my frayed green jacket violently out of her desperate grasp. The sudden force broke her hold and Patricia pitched forward, her hands slapping against the polished wood. I smoothed the wrinkled fabric of my coat, adjusting my collar with slow, methodical precision. I wanted her to see that I was entirely unaffected by her theatrical display. Her ultimate manipulation card had been played, and it had failed spectacularly. The emotional tether she had used to drag me through the mud for my entire life was permanently severed. I was standing in my own power, surrounded by the wreckage of their lies, and I was absolutely untouchable. "You do not get to call me your daughter tonight," I stated. My voice was a frigid, echoing strike in the quiet dining room. You lost the right to use that word 4 years ago. You let me freeze in my car through the bitter winter. I wrapped myself in cheap blankets and woke up with frost on my windows, wondering how I was going to afford my next meal. And while I was shivering in the dark, you were living like absolute royalty on my stolen money. You drank imported wine, you bought designer clothes, and you funded Jamal's fake empire using the assets you ripped from my bleeding hands. Patricia sobbed, shaking her head, trying to form a pathetic excuse. Her voice was muffled as she pressed her forehead against the floorboards. I did it for the family, she choked out, still trying to spin a fraudulent narrative. I did not let her speak another word. Do not dare invoke family loyalty, I commanded, projecting my voice so every federal agent in the room could clearly hear me. Family protects each other. Family does not commit federal wire fraud to finance a luxury car dealership. You are not a victim of a misunderstanding. You are a predator who finally got caught in her own trap. Greed put you in this position, Patricia, not me. Your own bottomless, sickening greed engineered this exact moment. A sharp, commanding voice cut through the air before Patricia could formulate another pathetic plea for mercy. Stand up, Patricia. Have some shred of dignity. It was Grandmother Beatrice. She stepped away from the head of the table, her posture rigid and her eyes blazing with an intense, unyielding disgust. She looked at her daughter groveling on the floor, and then she turned her furious gaze to Richard, who was shrinking into the shadows, and to Natalie, who was still weeping into her hands. Beatrice had built her massive fortune through grueling hard work and uncompromising integrity. Seeing her legacy squandered and weaponized by her own bloodline was the ultimate betrayal. She looked at the federal agents securing the perimeter and then locked eyes with me. There was a profound, silent communication between us. She recognized my strength. She saw the undeniable truth in my meticulous investigation. Beatrice turned directly to Lawyer Harrison, who was already holding a fresh legal pad and a silver pen, preparing to record her official directives. Harrison, Beatrice announced, her voice echoing with absolute finality. I am entirely rewriting my will right here, right now. I want every single previous document revoked and shredded immediately. You will draw up the paperwork tonight. My entire estate, every liquid asset, every real estate holding, and every corporate stock is to be transferred into a blind trust. Natalie gasped loudly, her tear-streaked face shooting up from her hands. Jamal closed his eyes, accepting his absolute doom. They had just lost the millions they had been counting on to save them from this catastrophe. And, Beatrice continued, her tone ruthless and absolute, that blind trust will be exclusively managed by Clara. She is the sole beneficiary and the sole executor of my entire legacy. Patricia, Richard, Natalie, and Jamal are completely disinherited. They will not receive a single dime from my accounts. They are entirely cut off. The financial safety net they had always relied upon was officially incinerated right before their eyes. They were left with absolutely nothing but the impending federal charges, the complete seizure of their fake assets, and the horrifying reality of their imminent arrest. The special agents stepped forward, pulling out their heavy steel handcuffs. The time for talking and manipulating had ended, and the long, agonizing nightmare of their legal destruction was just beginning. They were finally reaping exactly what they had sown. They had chosen an empire of deceit, and I had provided the wrecking ball. The opulent dining room was no longer a place of celebration. It was the absolute ground zero of their total irreversible ruin. Now they had to pay for the unforgivable damage they had inflicted upon my life, day after day behind cold prison bars. Their absolute downfall was entirely their fault. The heavy steel handcuffs finally clicked around my mother's wrists, producing a sharp metallic snap that signaled the definitive end of her tyrannical reign. The federal agents escorted Patricia, Richard, and Jamal out of the grand mansion, reading them their Miranda rights under the cold, flashing lights of the tactical vehicles parked in the driveway. The entire wealthy neighborhood stood on their manicured lawns, watching the spectacular public collapse of the most arrogant family in Connecticut. The fallout was incredibly rapid and brutally unforgiving. The United States justice system moved with a terrifying efficiency that left my toxic relatives absolutely no room to breathe. Jamal was the first to completely break under the immense pressure of the federal indictment. His luxury car showroom was officially seized by the government, the imported sports cars impounded and auctioned off to cover the massive laundering fines. Facing an overwhelming mountain of forensic financial evidence, his high-priced public defender advised him to take a plea deal. He stood in a federal courtroom stripped of his custom-tailored suits, wearing standard-issue prison orange. He wept openly when the gavel fell, realizing that his arrogant boasting had led directly to his imprisonment. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and tax evasion. His fake empire dissolved into thin air, leaving Natalie completely destitute, drowning in frozen credit card debt, and entirely abandoned by the high society friends she had spent years trying to impress. Patricia and Richard faced an equally devastating reality. The Internal Revenue Service showed them absolutely zero mercy. The federal government placed massive tax liens on every single asset they possessed to recover the hundreds of thousands of dollars in evaded taxes, plus staggering criminal penalties. Their precious Connecticut mansion, the ultimate symbol of their fake superiority, was foreclosed on and seized. I stood on the sidewalk across the street months later and watched as federal contractors carried Patricia's expensive crystal chandeliers, antique furniture, and designer wardrobes out the front door to be liquidated at public auction. She screamed at the federal contractors as they loaded her prized possessions into moving trucks, but her protests fell on deaf ears. They lost absolutely everything. The parents who had proudly thrown their injured daughter out into the cold were now facing the exact same destitution they had weaponized against me. They were forced to move into a tiny, dilapidated apartment in a low-income neighborhood, their reputation entirely obliterated. Their country club memberships were revoked. Their wealthy friends blocked their numbers, and they were left to spend the rest of their lives suffocating in the shameful, miserable reality they had built with their own unbridled greed. While their world burned to the ground, my life finally began. With the forged power of attorney officially nullified by the federal court, the deed to the Aspen vacation home was legally restored to my name. I did not evict the elderly couple who had been scammed by my mother. Instead, I worked with lawyer Harrison to draft a new legitimate and incredibly fair lease agreement that allowed them to live out their retirement in peace. The revenue from that legitimate lease, combined with my own highly successful freelance income, provided me with a massive influx of clean, secure capital. I drove my battered sedan for the absolute last time, not to find a dark parking lot to sleep in, but to commute to a premium commercial real estate office in downtown Seattle. I signed the lease on a massive light-filled studio space. I moved out of my car and into a beautiful penthouse apartment overlooking the city skyline. I officially launched my own independent 3D animation studio, hiring a team of talented designers and securing massive commercial contracts. My portfolio expanded to include major motion picture studios and global advertising campaigns. I was no longer the outcast hiding in the shadows. I was the chief executive officer of a thriving creative agency, fully backed by the immense financial trust my grandmother Beatrice had placed entirely under my strict control. I built a life that was rich not just in wealth, but in genuine peace and unshakable self-respect. I reclaimed my life, my assets, and my future by refusing to let toxic family members dictate my worth. I built my empire on a foundation of absolute integrity, exhausting hard work, and undeniable truth. The freezing nights I spent sleeping in the backseat of my car taught me a profound, undeniable lesson about human nature and the true meaning of loyalty. We are taught from a very young age that family is supposed to be a safe harbor, a guaranteed sanctuary against the harsh realities of the unforgiving world. We are constantly told to forgive and forget simply because of shared DNA. But my journey proved that those societal expectations are often weaponized by narcissists to keep their victims trapped in a cycle of endless abuse. Blood is just a biological coincidence. It is never a free pass for cruelty. You do not owe your sanity, your finances, or your future to people who only view you as a convenient resource to exploit. Have you ever discovered that the people meant to protect you were the ones holding the knife? Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to save your own life? Tell me about your journey in the comments section below. Share your experiences, your hard-fought victories, and the exact moments you finally decided to stand up for yourself against impossible odds. Your stories matter, and your incredible strength deserves to be recognized. Hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more empowering stories of surviving toxic families and taking back absolute control of your destiny. The story of Clara's triumph over her toxic family serves as a powerful testament to a difficult but necessary truth: shared DNA does not obligate you to endure abuse. For too long, society has peddled the narrative that family is an unbreakable bond, an unconditional safe harbor that must be maintained at all costs. However, Clara's harrowing journey from sleeping in a freezing car to dismantling a massive financial fraud orchestrated by her own parents shatters this illusion entirely. The central lesson here is profound and liberating. Blood is merely a biological coincidence, and it is never a free pass for cruelty. When the people meant to protect you become the ones holding the knife, clinging to the title of family only perpetuates a vicious cycle of victimization. Clara's ultimate victory was not just reclaiming her stolen property or seeing her abusers face federal justice, it was the internal triumph of recognizing her own self-worth. She realized that she did not owe her sanity, her wealth, or her future to individuals who viewed her merely as a convenient asset to exploit. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine love, not manipulation, gaslighting, and greed. And walking away from toxic relatives requires an immense amount of courage, as it often means stepping into the unknown and facing heavy societal judgment. Yet setting an absolute steel boundary is frequently the only way to save yourself. It allows you to transition from being a helpless scapegoat to the empowered architect of your own destiny. True healing begins the exact moment you stop seeking validation from those who are entirely incapable of giving it. If you are currently trapped in a toxic family dynamic, take that brave first step today to set your boundaries and reclaim your life.